When you look back at your past experiences with food, maybe you're at the dinner table or in the kitchen. The memories, the dishes, the individuals you've shared them with, their stories, the foods. Here lies a wealth of information about your history and culture, ready to uncover. So food is the vehicle. Food is the lens. Food is the opportunity. And it's something that we engage with every day that speaks volumes about where we come from, what stories we have to tell, and why we're here.
Finally tonight, one man's journey into his own personal history and into the roots and history of American cooking and cuisine.
Michael Twitty is a culinary historian who explores the complicated story of race, culture, and food.
Everybody has this deep connections to gastronomy in their personal, familial lives. Our story is told through our plates.
I made this vow to uncover and amplify the stories of my African ancestors through food. So I've dedicated my life to tracing my family roots by way of the food I've been exposed to. Food is memory, and this is my way of preserving my ancestors' legacy for the next generation. My name is Michael W. Twitty. I'm a culinary historian, historic interpreter, and the James Beard Award-winning author of The Cooking Chain. I want to teach this class because I want to give you an introduction to the African-American vision of food and culture that you've never been exposed to. A culture that's vibrant, that's exciting, but also very serious and based in a history that involves healing and memory. Some of you may have heard of my work, The Cooking Gene. It's a journey through my family history and a journey through the Old South, looking for the roots of soul foods, the foodscapes of soul food, and where we come from. I really wanted people to understand the culinary journey, the food journey of African Americans in a way that would ennoble us and ennoble our ancestors and give our children and our descendants something to be proud of and a clear vision of where they come from and the legacy they have to live up to. After fighting and struggling to get this book into the world, it eventually won 2 James Beard Awards in 2018. One for Best Writing and one for Book of the Year, making me one of the first Black American authors in the history of James Beard to do so. In this class, I want to share with you my process for connecting with my ancestors through food. I'm gonna eat this right in front of y'all, right? No shame in my game. I want to give you a deep understanding of African American foodways. But I also want you to go out and trace the foodways of your own culture and tell that story. By walking you through my journey tracing my family foodways, I hope to help you uncover your own food roots and develop a deeper connection to your own ancestors. Just so you know, what this class is not is a full-on cooking school of African American culinary technique. It's a little bit more complex than that. It's about ideas, it's about the food, it's about how we relate to the food and talking about new ways to express our relationship to the food through writing, through storytelling, through genealogy. It's about the conversations and the cooking and what the eating and sharing and the values mean to us. So there's a reason why I come to this space with my ancestors, with my own personal family history and personal experiences. It's because those experiences and those lives matter. That knowledge base that comes from our lived experience matters. So for me as a Black man, not just a Black man, not just a Black American, not just an African American, but someone with my busy intersection of identities, Black, gay, Jewish, Southern, male, all of those things put together mean that if my lens and in my experience is something rich and worthy of dialogue, so is yours. We all have these stories to tell based on all the things that make us unique. And if I can do it, I hope that you will as well. I hope that you will have the strength to say that your story matters as much as mine does. I hope this class will inspire you to get deeper involved. It's an addiction, I will warn you. And if that bug wears off on you through this class, great. I have no responsibility for the outcomes, but I really wanted it to be about the appreciation, about the respect, about the engagement, about the documentation, all the things that will keep this particular cuisine and its devotees vibrant and sustained for generations to come. I should be a politician. I'm Michael Twitty, and this is my masterclass. You know, I have a saying that your food is your flag. Your plate and your palate go hand in hand. And understanding that makes your life feel so much more richer or fuller. See, that's why the food stories are so important, because they give us those elements of life that we can understand. Some of us barely know our ancestors' names, if that. When they were born and when they died, what their birthday was. Those things weren't recorded. And to be honest with you, peasant people, rustic, rural people, enslaved people, people who were cogs in the Industrial Revolution, all kind of have the same story of anonymity. But this is how I give them back their existence. People's recipes can be incredible windows into their stories as lived at the time, but also the legacies that they pass down. But you can actually take a recipe and deconstruct, well, when did those ingredients show up? How will the recipe change over time? If there are things that we use that are semi-homemade or semi-processed now, what would they have been generations ago? At one time, there was no such thing as vegetable oil being offered. Soybeans were not being grown. So what was that chicken frying in? What kind of meat went in those greens, if any meat at all? What kind of peas were they? Why was this cake only made this time of year? What would it have taken to produce something special like a dessert or a confection when you didn't eat that way during most of the calendar year? And so there's all these beautiful and incredible and exciting questions you can divine just from a recipe. Let's look at Hoppin' John, for example, the Southern bacon, peas, and rice dish. Red cow peas were first introduced to the U.S. by way of the transatlantic slave trade. Here, they medium mixed with Carolina Gold rice to make Hoppin' John. The recipe wasn't officially recorded until nearly 200 years later. And by the 1910s, when hurricanes ravaged the Lowcountry, this type of rice, which required extensive manual labor to produce, was left by the wayside. The red cow pea was hyperlocal and was replaced by the black-eyed pea on the mainland during the Great Migration. During the Great Depression, federal shopping guidelines recommended a version of this inexpensive dish, Hoppin' John with tomato sauce. And the recipe is published in newspapers around the country, helping skyrocket the dish's popularity. And so by analyzing and breaking down those pieces of information, we're able to ask deeper questions about where our family has been and who we are and why we cook the way we do. And it doesn't matter how many times you turn it upside down, read it backwards, read it forward, analyze every word, it always has new stories to tell. And for me, that is the most exhilarating part of this work, is that no matter how many times I leave and come back, those recipes have volumes to speak about the lives of our ancestors. And what's even more exciting than that is our own recipes have volumes to speak about the stories that we engender. So a lot of you will ask the question, and have asked the question to me of, how do I go about making sure these recipes don't die? How do I engage with the master cooks in my family? Do not stick a smartphone in their face. Go in there with open ears, open mind, open stomach, open eyes. Absorb everything with your senses. Be absolutely present. Because sometimes when we use our technology, we understand that technology can be revisited if it's properly recorded. So we don't take the time to be present in the moment. When you record them, what are you doing? You're in their face with a camera. It's not where the action is. The action is in those time-honored, best cooking utensils you have. The hands. How are they cupped? How are they moving? My grandmother could cut a tomato in her hand like a cutting board and never got a nick. And I tried that mess once and I almost lost everything I had. So it's to be present. Take assessment of all the ingredients. You want to know how that cake is made, how that salad's made, or that whatever. Really be present, really be observant, and help. The next time you ask, can I hold that? Why only this type of powdered whatever, herb or spice? What do you look for? What time of year do you make this? And then, can I hold the ingredients? Can I touch them? Can I see how much you're putting in? Because none of our elders measure anything, except very rarely with something that's baking, because baking's a little less forgiving. But just being able to do that, okay, here's the trick. So the minute they say, can I hold that sugar in my hand? Is when you kind of have your measuring cups and measuring spoons at the ready, so you can do guesstimations, but they don't need to know that. But you engage them. You ask them questions about, why is this dish in your life? Who taught you? Okay, that's the second round. And every time you make the thing and you eat it, ask questions like, is this good? Does it taste good? What needs to be improved? What do you like about it? Does it taste as good as the first time you had it? Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's not. Then the third time, you make it for them. And then when you make it, don't let them touch a thing. Have them direct you. And then again, you sit down and you eat it and you ask questions and you ask about funny stories and things that make it memorable. And if you're really good at this, you're gonna have a moment where you close your eyes and then you open them, and that entire table will be surrounded by the people that populated that person's life. And if you're lucky enough, you can have the next generations around the table too, to learn that dish or those ingredients anew and have them contribute to the cycle of rebirth that are our recipes. I often like to talk about, and I would like to share with you, what it was like growing up for me. A lot of us have these sort of Norman Rockwell-ish images of our childhood. And mine in particular are kind of ridiculous because I was a very funny and wacky future gay of America Black kid in a average household with Southern roots. And that meant I grew up learning how to make the iced tea every night. That was, going to school, and the teacher said to us one time, we all drink milk with dinner. And all the Black kids were like, no, we don't. We drink iced tea with dinner. We didn't know about drinking milk. Milk made us sick because we were all lactose intolerant. And growing up was sweeping the floor. That was important. That was something that you learned to do the minute you could hold a broom. You didn't just get to eat in the kitchen. You had to perform some kind of labor to get fed. You didn't know any different. My mother was my more important and more direct culinary teacher. And I treasure every moment that I remember of cleaning greens with my mom, because that's where we got to talk and dialogue. And I remember that she used to do the same thing with my grandmother and with my aunts. So then it was my turn. And then eventually it got to the point where my mother could just leave me at the table and do that. And then it was my job. And I felt like something had been passed down to me, and I felt responsible. And I felt honored. And then barbecuing with my daddy. That's a very Southern thing to do from father to son. And I mean, it wasn't just little things. It was racks, and it was beef, and it was chicken, all that good stuff. And that oil can grill and cutting the wood with my father. And my father, I wasn't a sporty kid, and I wasn't an athletic kid, and I wasn't into all that. But I could show a barbecue, and it still puts a smile on my face when I think about my father saying, "Oh, I like that color, son. Oh, you done good." And he'd pat me on the back, and I felt like such a young man. And that's the kind of feeling that I think you probably have in your hearts regarding some of the best moments of your childhood with food. And it's one of the things that I have. You know, to this day, I every time I think about any of those situations, I get immediately filled with feelings of not lament, but great amount of love, and the appreciation that I have that my parents and my grandparents gave me a tradition. They gave me a legacy of integrity and talent that I've used to support myself and give myself access to the American dream. Thank you, Mama. Thank you, Grandmama. Thank you, Daddy. If you've read The Cooking Gene or read stories about me, I use the term food steps. And of course, that's a play on footsteps. We need to recognize the migrational narratives that are part of all of our histories. These patterns of movement back and forth across the Atlantic, Africa to America, America to Africa, the Caribbean to America, those stories matter. And for me, you know, you talk about it and it's like, okay, you talk about it. But when you actually say to someone, you know, when you were in Notting Hill or you were in Brixton in London and you went down to Electric Avenue like Eddie Grant sang about, and you saw the okra and the Scotch bonnets and the bami and the coconut. And immediately you have a story of Caribbean migration to England. And the persistence of these foods across hundreds of years of British engagement with the transatlantic nature of Black history. And in the same way you go to Amsterdam and you see collard greens where the Afro-Surinamese live. In the same way you go to Harlem and see collard greens also from North Carolina brought up on a truck, talking about the Great Migration. So these food steps, foods in place of the other markers that we use to tell stories about memory, about migration, about movement, help us really determine where people have been, what they've picked up, what matters to them, meaning. And so we put on these different layers as we go about moving across the globe and across the map that tell stories about how we eat and where we've been. And that's so impactful because it shows change. If you want to trace your own food steps, this is where you should look. Think about the staples. I always ask people, what are the staples in your family diet? Now, some of y'all gonna roll out with pizza and something else. Okay, well, let's go back on that. For some people, that staple is corn-based or rice-based or yam-based or cassava-based. Okay, bread-based. There's all these different options, usually carbohydrates, right? And I realized that for some of you, you've changed your lifestyle and your diet to fit something that might be better for your health or that vibes better with your lifestyle in a not so traditional sense, and I respect that. But what I'm getting at is, what are those traditions that you come from? Some of which you maintain, some of which you don't. And I think it's important, just as important to document the things that we no longer do, as well as the things that we do. So for me, it was looking at the staples, for example, rice from my grandfather's family from South Carolina, corn and sweet potatoes from my Virginia and Alabama folks. It was looking at the fact that we always had certain ingredients in the pantry. Always scallions, always onions, always hot peppers, always lemons, bouillon cubes, things that you could begin to make a meal from. Always leafy greens, spinach, collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, and now for me, sweet potato leaves as well. And just how do you build a meal? If you ask yourself the question, what was always in the pantry? What's always in your pantry? What are the staple ingredients you can find in every dish in your culture? So for example, if you're Palestinian, bakharat, the 9-spice plus mixture, is found in makluba, it's found in kofte, kebab, it's found in everything. That is the signature flavor. Or if you're from Republic of Georgia, walnuts and pomegranates and dill and other herbs. If you come from the African Atlantic, the chances are that tomatoes, onions, peppers, ginger, garlic, foods like that are gonna be part of your pantry is really high. Because you can take those and use them to make almost anything. The assignment for you is to define what food trinities are a part of your life. And that can be outside of your own cultural bubble. So for example, there are different bubbles. But it's inescapable that we tend to absorb some of the foods of our neighbors. I mean, if you can be Hasidic in Crown Heights and eat jerk chicken that's kosher, you can do anything. So, but that's the beauty of being in America, despite all of our faults, that we do absorb each other and each other's cultures. And you look at the trinities you keep in your kitchen. So, I know that in my kitchen, there's fish sauce, there's soy sauce, there's tamarind, there's date syrup. So there are African, African-American, Afro-Caribbean, Middle Eastern, there's Southeast Asian, East Asian, and South Asian food trinities. And sometimes they match up. Like garlic is almost in every single one of the food trinities that I'm a part of. From that standpoint, we're getting into your culinary creativity as well. Because you can take any of those things, and as long as they kind of the flavors kind of match up, then you can be in a space of total exploration and freedom. But I guess the most important thing is to acknowledge that if those things are important to you and you pass those on to your descendants, you are now part of the dynamism that is cultural change. So for the next 2 or 3 generations, you may be in a far different flavor universe than your great-great-great-grandparents were. And that's okay. But what's important is that you document that shift and that growth and acknowledge the sources. Acknowledge your neighbors. Acknowledge the people that you are privileged to share humanity with. And for those of you who are coming from the United States, your Americanness with. And for those of you who are in multicultural democracies, people with whom you share your world. That too is important to document so that we understand it, that we know, that we do borrow from each other. We do share with each other. We do commune and communicate with each other. And sometimes we take without asking and we take without having any sort of kumbaya moment. But it is responsible in a multicultural society and democracy to be able to give more than just a nod to our neighbors, but to understand the gifts and the beauties that they've given us as much as we've given our own to others. So you've got to understand what your staples are, what your key ingredients are, what your trinities are, and why they make you feel a certain way about the food on your plate. When I was doing my research, one of the most important things that I was able to do was finally set foot in Africa. I knew that there were all these connections, right? Between the continent and between the South and Latin America and the Caribbean. But when you get there and you see the markets full of black-eyed peas and hot peppers and peanuts and leafy greens like coca yam and sweet potato leaves and even collard greens, and you see sweet potatoes and yams and cassava, all of that. And you see people making fritters and frying things and frying chicken and roasting meat with spices, the grandfather dish to what we call barbecue and all these different pieces. You know you come from somewhere. You know that you're a part of something bigger. You're no longer as small as that county in Kentucky or Alabama or Texas where your folks came from. It's bigger than that. It's an amazing feeling of just I got people, and I come from somewhere. And this space that I've never been to is somehow home for me in a way I never knew. You know, the minute my foot set down the ground in Senegal, my world became much bigger than it ever had been before. And I remember the feeling of saying, thank God I'm here, but even more so was the fact that when I got to West Africa, the minute the plane landed, and I'm serious about this, everybody from the people around me on the plane to the folks who were working for the airline to the people who were at the airport, every single person said the following words: welcome home. When following the clues in the food stories and migratory patterns of my ancestors, I decided I want to communicate them in a way that would engrave and honor their memory. And so the cooking gene was born. I originally started on a journey called the Southern Discomfort Tour, obviously a play on Southern Comfort, back in 2011. And I didn't know how I was gonna pay for it. All I knew is I was gonna do this journey. And I talked with my then partner and I said, well, let's go on a journey through the entire former antebellum South and colonial South, looking for my food routes and family roots and foodscapes, past and present. And so I'd never done crowdfunding before. We did that, it was successful. Got on the road, went all the way from Maryland to Texas, Missouri to Florida, over the course of 3 or 4 different journeys from the summer to the fall of 2012. To imagine what it would have been like to pick 40, 50 acres of cotton. I had all this information, all these pictures, all these photographs, all this video, all these interviews, and I was just sort of sitting on it until a certain food personality was now in the public light for some negative press. And I used that opportunity to talk about the fact that here we were focusing on this one element, and we still didn't have a concept of what Black Americans, African Americans, and people of African descent in the Americas, the impact we made on food. And that was a lot of the food that she was cooking and other people around her were cooking, but you didn't hear our stories. And that letter to her, that open letter, went viral. My phone began to ring off the hook. And by that afternoon, Huffington Post got a hold of me and said, can we republish your piece? And I'm thinking to myself, how the hell did Huffington Post get a hold of me? And why do they care? But it was getting so much traffic, and it created a platform for me to finally be able to take those stories and those interviews and that research I had done and move it to the next level, which was a book. And so I went from having not one single opportunity to talk to a literary agent to a dozen calling me overnight. And I had to whittle it down to the best that I could find. And then I was always asked the question, do you have a book idea in mind? And I said, well, why, yes, I have this project. And I think I want to call it The Cooking Gene. Well, why The Cooking Gene? Because, there's that phrase, some people will say, oh, well, I don't have the cooking gene. And I wanted to talk about, our food history and our culture, but not just kind of in an amorphous sort of generic way. I wanted to be able to say, I am the descendant of the blank. And because of that, this is my relationship with this food or this tradition or whatever. So the cooking gene wasn't just gonna be for me some cookbook where I divulged Grandmama Nim's culinary secrets. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to say that we were like every other American people, if not the most American people. For me, the greatest challenge in writing The Cooking Gene was being able to tell this mosaic story in a way that people could understand. I mean, I had a lot of editors and publishing companies where they only could understand history told in a Western linear fashion. And the problem with that is that we're not, we're not just a Western people, we're an African people. So the way we tell stories is either cyclical or in ways that are not a straight line. And then on top of that, I didn't have enough information about my sixth great grandmother, other than the fact that she was put on a boat, she was Mende, she was from Sierra Leone, she was a young woman of childbearing age, and she had the words R-A-C-E, race, the Royal African Company of England branded on her back. And she was sent to Charleston, South Carolina, right before the American Revolution. So I can't make a whole volume out of that, but I can tell you about that rice that she knew how to grow, that was part of her people's life for thousands of years, that started in West Africa 4,000 years ago. From wild to domesticated, from that to a plantation crop. And what that meant for women like her, I can tell you that story. So for me, it was about telling the story through the ingredients or through the regions that they came from, because that made the most sense, because I had to move across time and space. I had to move between the ancestors' time and my time. So how you organize your work and how you organize these stories really depends on what is most important to you. Mark Twain had a saying about his own birth and death, which was that he came into the world with Halley's Comet, and he would go out with Halley's Comet. I came into the world with Alex Haley's Comet, Roots. Every Black household, Black American household in particular, had a copy of Roots. At the time that Roots was published, America was looking back at what its 200 plus years as an independent state meant, what its history meant, what our identity meant. The only reason why we have an explosion in Black genealogy and people getting their DNA done is because we all want to have that Alex Haley moment where we can say, "You old African, I found you." And the fact that that has outlasted this man means he put a fire in us and a desire in our heart that has not gone out. And that's why I wrote The Cooking Gene. I always wanted to write my own version of Roots, and I wanted to do it through food. And I did it. When I went to begin my book, I happened to be in the Memphis area, and the little town of Henning, Tennessee, where Alex Haley grew up, in his grandmother's house. That house is still there, and we went all the way from Memphis to Henning, an hour plus out of the city. And his grave is right on the front lawn next to that porch where he heard those stories. And I have a picture of me pouring libation at the grave of Alex Haley, and I said to him, "Hey, look, I never got to meet you, but you've changed my life and the life of millions of us around the world, and people who are not Black. Look at, it inspired them to do their genealogy and find their roots." But at any rate, I was at that grave, y'all, and I poured that libation, and I cried, and I said, "I don't know how I'm gonna do this. I don't know how I'm gonna get to Africa. I don't know how I'm gonna feel. I don't know, I don't have the money, I don't have the this, I don't have the that. All I know is I gotta do what she did. I need all the help I can get." And I was there at that exact spot for 15, 14 minutes, however long it took for me to get all those emotions out. And when I was drained, I got up and I said, "Thank you, Alex." And I walked away with this feeling of maybe, just maybe, whatever I said and did meant something or was gonna do something. Half the magic is in whether or not the ritual works for you, not how you work the ritual. So I got up after spending, an hour and a half at the site, got back in the car, went past the cotton and soybean fields, right on back to Memphis. That's the last time I was there. But within a very short amount of time, that experience translated into me fulfilling dreams that had been in me since I was a little boy. And that's what Alex Haley and Roots means to me. And now I live um, 45 minutes away from where Kunta Kinte was enslaved. No accidents in life. The transatlantic slave trade was a major catalyst in African American cuisine and culture. During this time, enslavement fueled the engine-moving cash crops about the Atlantic world. But there is a second narrative, one far more empowering. From roughly 1440 to the middle of the 19th century, foods, along with other important cultural artifacts, traveled with enslaved Africans, ensuring the continuation of aspects of their cultures. And Africa at that time was home to 2,000, and still is, home to 2,000 plus indigenous food plants. Africans would have their own varieties of peanuts that would arrive in the American South, not from South America where the peanut began, but from West Africa on slave ships. And those slave ships also brought okra, sesame seeds, watermelon, muskmelon, varieties of cola and coffee, varieties of plantains and bananas that had long since been variegated in West Africa. There was an effort made to bring over yams. There was an effort made to bring over cocoyam, cassava, sweet potatoes, other things that had become part of the diet. And this slabber sauce was nothing in comparison to what they would grow for themselves in the New World. So in order to get Africans to eat on the way over, they had to use the foods they were familiar with. Many Africans chose to starve themselves or to protest because the food was awful, it was low quality. So what you need to understand is that these crops were not brought by the enslaved themselves, but were brought in steerage to feed them on the journey and to be planted once they arrived in the West Indies, Brazil, or North America. And once they were there, they became staples of a diet. And what's so powerful about this is that no matter where these people land, it didn't matter where the boat dropped them off. It's where it picked them up from. The commonality of all these foods in different places symbolizing a common African Atlantic Black identity that is so powerful because it defines the majority of the cuisines of the Americas to this day. When people think of slavery, they think of cotton because that's the American narrative, or at least one part of the American narrative. But for most of the history of New World slavery, we have to talk about sugar. Sugar was originally domesticated in the islands of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, on the verge of the Columbian voyages that would open up the Americas to colonization, settlement, war, displacement, and enslavement. They were looking for more room, more spaces to grow this tropical crop that would become an addiction for the West. Eventually, sugar will bring millions of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and to Brazil. And in the urge to open up other lands to grow sugarcane and make a crop that will make lots of money for people, sugarcane is the entry point for the Western Hemisphere to develop a whole culture around racial chattel slavery. And in all of this, there's us, the sugar planters, weeders, cultivators, cutters, boilers, molasses makers, rum makers, that feed a vicious triangular trade with West Africa by which rum is traded for human beings. Those human beings are brought to sugarcane growing areas of the tropical Americas. Those people produce molasses, which feeds other enslaved people and the poor of Western Europe and colonial America. And some of that molasses is then turned into rum, which feeds that triangle again. And we also become these confectioners. You can't just engage with this plant, and it's a food plant, right? And not become this people who have a sweet tooth. And that's the deep irony of it. Some people are triggered by the sight of cotton, but don't think twice about sitting down to tables where sugar is ever present. That addictive grass that made the transatlantic slave trade and our unfortunate global history with race and anti-Blackness possible. Corn. Corn was this crop that came from Teosinte, from indigenous people that lived in Mesoamerica. And it was a crop that they developed into one of the world's most important agricultural agents of change. So when that crop gets to Africa during that period of exploration, and Africans grow it, it becomes a major motivator for us to have more children because we have more food. But more children and more food mean more competition, means more people, means more people that can be caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. For those of us in North America, corn, in fact, becomes an important food through nixtamalization, which is a term from Nahuatl, Aztec, that means that the corn has been produced with lye or lime, so the essential amino acid lysine is there front and center, and it becomes a more easily digestible food. It's dehulled. And that food alone meant that Black people who came from Africa to North America had a more sustainable food source, and a food source that was more nutritious when consumed with other vegetables and proteins than the food that was being ingested by people in the Caribbean and now Latin America, Brazil, and beyond. That crop was the crop that turned into hominy, turned into grits, turned into the coating for their chicken, turned into the corn cakes that they ate on a daily basis called hoe cakes and ash cakes. The corn shucks were their mattresses where they slept and made their children. The corn husking ritual that happened every fall was how our great-great-great-great-grandmothers and great-great-great-great-grandfathers met each other. You know, whoever got the red ear of corn got to kiss the girl of his dreams. When the enslaved girl would go to the dance at the corn shucking, she would soak her petticoat in the liquid that came of making the hominy, making the grits, that had starch in it. So that when she went to the dance and she popped her dress, it made a snapping sound. All the boys would turn their head and look at her. That's very different from when you're reading the books. The slaves, they were enslaved. They were not slaves. Enslaved is a condition. Slave is an identity. My ancestors and many of yours weren't no damn slaves. They were enslaved. Let's get that right. Those enslaved ancestors, you know, when you read about in the book, it's like the slaves got corn, pork, and saltfish, and that was it. You know, screw the fact that they had lives, that they loved each other, that when they were sick, your grandmother would put corn silk in a pipe and blow it in your ear to cure an ear infection. Screw the fact that an ear of corn on a piece of string was a power object, a charm, to keep people from stealing out your field. Forget the fact that people would take the corn stalks and suck the sugar out of them for energy because they're being worked to death. So that's why the food stories are so important, because they give us those elements of life that we could understand. Some of you may come to this space and you're saying, well, I have all these recipes passed down from my grandmother, great-grandmother, from other relatives or ancestors, or even from my parents, or things we share with each other in this current generation. So how do I connect that to my family history or to our culture? And the answer is simple but complex. You know, you have to sort of look at one particular dish or a family of dishes, and then you can trace it back to its origin story. And so for the Mende people of Sierra Leone, from whom I come, from whom the mothers who produced my maternal grandmother and mother came from, rice, specifically made with the tomato and onion and peppers, is something that you make that's comforting. That's something a dish that women take pride in. And for me, every time I make red rice, I'm reminded that Mama Bove had a daughter whose name I'll never know. And that daughter had a daughter named Nora. And Nora had a daughter named Hester. And Hester had a daughter named Josephine. And Josephine had a daughter named Mary. And Mary had a daughter named Hazel. And Hazel had a daughter named Patricia. And Patricia had a son named Michael, who she said was the best thing she ever cooked because she cooked him for 9 months in her belly, low and slow. And not only is that how I became an American, but that's how come I came to love a dish that for me represents the story of the mothers who created soul food. But I tell you this story because I want you to understand that, the foods and the things that we associate with our best and most intimate and most emotional parts of our family experience often have these really deep, impressionable roots that we should take pride in. Throughout the 250 years before emancipation, West and Central African methods of cooking, traditional ingredients, and creolized versions of African dishes came to be considered distinctly Southern. But we need to talk about how African American cuisine came of age. When people talk about slave food, you may have heard that term slave food, and some people unfortunately attach it to soul food. Soul food is a modern construct. I think that's a misnomer that we need to correct with each other. So, for example, enslaved people were given rations. But from what we know, the basic ration system involved corn or rice, unbalted. In other words, you had to process it yourself. So you were given the corn to make into meal. You were given the rice to be pounded and to be milled as well. You were given salted pork or smoked pork in very small amounts. This was not a food, it was more of a condiment. It was more of a means to get salt to people. A small piece of the boiled meat might go into potatoes or leafy greens or beans or peas, into fresh vegetables like snap beans, collard greens, etc. And those things were grown by the people. Again, agency and ownership. Not every food was given to the enslaved by white people. I really detest that narrative because it makes us sound like pets, like domesticated animals. And of course, the idea of chattel slavery is to equate the Black human being, the Black body, with that kind of bestial level of existence. And it wasn't that simple. Who do you think grew the corn and wheat and the rice? It was us. So basically, our own production was given back to us in another form as a ration. Some of our ancestors who were Muslim refused to eat pork. So they were given their ration in salt beef or in fish. Some people only had fish in the very beginning of colonial slavery. There was very little pork. So again, colloquial and discretionary based on what were the major crops there, what was accessible. Molasses occasionally makes an appearance as a ration. Because remember, we're talking about people who were living, our ancestors, at a time that was before easy access to sugar. And sugar, of course, and fruit and other things were important for energy. They grew watermelons mainly for the liquid, for hydration. They didn't know what vitamins were, what nutrients were, but they knew what was better for their bodies and what wasn't. Some enslaved people had gardens, some did not. Some had larger gardens they were given rations out of by the enslaved cook or by the overseer or driver. So in slavery, there were multiple ways that people obtained their basic staples. For example, I tell people all the time, when our ancestors lived on the southeast coast of America and on the Gulf Coast and by the Mississippi River, their diet was much more diverse. And they were forced to forage, hunt, and farm in ways that cooperated with seasonality. Versus other folks who were locked into pieces of land where, okay, I guess you got your nutrients from your hog, hominy, and molasses, which led to dietary deficiencies like pellagra. Things that killed people because they didn't have enough vegetables to eat. Things that contributed to long clear. There's certain patterns that you see over and over and over again. You begin to see people cooking things in leaves, like the husks or the leaves of plantains and bananas. You see people barbecuing and grilling food. You see people frying foods. You see people combining legumes and rice, starches and beans and leaves. And you see people making these one-pot meals and stews that frequently utilize hot spices, ginger, garlic, tomato, onion, and beyond. And the other part of it is we're making fritters, and we're using that sugarcane juice that we boil down into syrup to sweeten them. And there's this whole family of foods that comes out of this tradition. And a lot of it has to do with time. We simply, as people who were being worked from sun to sundown, did not have the same time that other people did. And so you may ask the question, well, how come we're not a tradition of cutting things chiffonade or cooking things sous vide? Because we didn't have the time, and we didn't have the utensils, we didn't have the space. And we also came from an African tradition where building flavor in dishes, where the feeling behind and intuition and energy that the cook brings into the space are all far more important than the exact method by which the cooking gets done. And so the mortar and pestle is sacred. The cast iron pot is sacred. The fanner basket for the rice is sacred. And there are all these different tools and baskets and meanings, items that are invested with the unique energy the Yoruba called ashe, that make up the kitchen in the African Atlantic, have a different sort of energy and vibe than any other kitchen in world cuisines. You may have some understanding that the kitchens on these plantations were often separate buildings. Part of that was because of the fact that, we're talking about the 19th century where there were no fire alarms, where any increased fire activity meant that your home could be flammable. That's not the only reason. Part of it is also because labor and domesticity were not tied together. The house was supposed to look as though it was effortless and not a place of that kind of work. Meaning that in our own kitchens, if we're meat eaters, we take meat out of plastic. We don't butcher and slaughter animals in those spaces, and we don't typically have to sweep out vegetable peelings and remains to the animals. That was why kitchens were separate. Kitchens were also not just kitchens. People slept up in the loft. The people who slept up in the loft were the enslaved. And kitchens were not just spaces where cooking and cleaning took place. These were also the spaces where our grandmothers were violated. And that was because of a very particular reason. You could close and lock that door. The white mistress of those plantations might not go in that building very often. But if you look at the narratives left by our ancestors, they talk frequently about how when the white mistress of the plantation or the farm where enslaved people were, because not everybody lived in a plantation. A plantation was specifically 20 or more enslaved people and a significant acreage. That's what made you a planter. If you had less than that and significantly less land holdings, you were just a farmer who happened to hold people in bondage. At any rate, those spaces and others were spaces where Black women were not safe. And when we talk about this kind of trauma, it's important. It's not about making anyone feel a particular kind of way. It's not about making Black people angry and white people feel guilty. That's not where it's at. It's about telling a historical truth. Because if we don't acknowledge where the traumas are, we can't begin to work on our healing. And furthermore, the most important commodity, and I need to say this in the clear fashion to you where it's unmistakable. The most important commodity before the Civil War was not cotton, it was not tobacco, it was not rice, it was not indigo, it wasn't wheat, it wasn't corn, it wasn't sugar. It was the womb of the Black woman. Because from our grandmothers came the most valuable resource and asset the United States had before the Civil War, the body of the enslaved Black. Nothing was worth more, nothing had more capital, and nothing had more potential to become capital than our ancestors' bodies. I really encourage you to grow the food, to go to the water, to get the fish out of the water, to go to the farm, to see how animals live. These are small tastes of our ancestors' world. And it was a world where everything was organic because that's all they had, and everything was free range, and everything was handcrafted because all they had. All those buzz terms in food that people use, our ancestors didn't have a choice. And for me, part of the most thrilling and also devastating part of what I do, what I've chosen to do, is I've chosen to go and do more than just the cooking on the open hearth in these brick kitchens and over fires outside. I've chosen to pick cotton. I've chosen to work in tobacco fields. I've chosen to go into the sugarcane field and see what that was like. I've chosen to go into rice fields. Unfortunately, I went in flip-flop, which is not a thing you should do. But, because there are alligators and poisonous snakes there. But I think that one of the most eerie and haunting experiences I ever had was the several times that I've gone to pick cotton for 16 hours. People will joke about this and talk about this, but they don't really understand what it's like to go into that field and have the sun hit the lint of the cotton and it blinds you because it's reflecting off of this just sea of white. And you can't see anything else, and it's hot, and you have to stay down, and you cannot get back up and snap back up suddenly, and your back hurts, and your hands hurt, and occasionally your hands get cut or pricked by the burr of the cotton ball. And then you have this moment of realization that, no, they weren't singing these sad, slow dirges. That's where the work songs came from. That's where the blues came from. That's where all of these pieces of our folklore and our humor and our life came from, surviving that kind of drudgery and torture. And it really put me in the mind of gratitude to the ancestors, because now I understood for a little bit, not just what they went through, but what my father went through, and my grandfather, his father before him, his father before him. And there was a point where I realized that here I am, the 6th generation of my family, to have had this experience. And I was suddenly filled with this overwhelming gratitude and thankfulness that I did not have to do that to survive. For the benefit of the wider audience, I want to kind of define soul food. In its broadest sense, soul food is the vernacular cuisine of African-American people, particularly those coming out of the American South. That can be defined by the U.S. Census South. It can be defined by the Confederacy, former Confederacy. It can be defined by the Mason-Dixon line. But it's not just located there. It's the food that moved with Black people during the Great Migration, when they ran away from enslavement and sought their freedom, as they went out west on the cattle trail, as they went out west to pan gold in California, when they went to go fight wars. All of those migrations and patterns spread a cuisine that's based on rural cooking: corn, pork, fish, chicken, leafy greens, black-eyed peas or cowpeas, peanuts, tomatoes, okra, rice, and the like. It's about food that comes from the farm, food that comes from the fields, the air, the water. And it's a foodways that is based on elements of West Central African tradition, European foodways from England, France, Germany, and other parts of Western Europe, and ingredients that have a strong basis in Native American indigenous cooking. So it's a mixture of all of those different elements that has become a cuisine of renown throughout the world. I've been known to say, you may know this, that soul food is the memory cuisine of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the enslaved. So in a lot of ways, soul food comes about as Black folks who are 1 to 2 generations born in the West, Midwest, and the Northeast are looking back at their Southern origins. In the same way that their colleagues, their girlfriends and boyfriends, their frenemies and enemies in other ethnic communities are looking at their own ethnic foodways and giving shape to them in New York or Chicago or Oakland or beyond, LA. So soul food, the term comes about in the 1960s along with terms like soul music, soul people. And, as I've been known to say, and I'll say it again, 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 there's no shame in that because we named our cuisine after something transcendental and invisible like love and God. We called it soul, something eternal, something you have to feel that can't be touched other than by means of spirit. And then there's soul, the big S, and soul, the little s. So you may be asking, what am I talking about? Well, there's soul food, the canon, and there's soul food, the construct. So as we discuss these common ancestral heritage foods and how they all connect and intersect and match up and you connect the dots, that's the construct or the principles of flavor and ideas of what goes together and what matches, what can be paired. Versus soul food, the canon, where we have soul food has to be a plate of greens, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, and fried chicken, and you have to have hot sauce with it. You gotta do this and da-da-da-da-da. Well, that may not be the soul food somebody grew up with. That's not the soul food of Edna Lewis. And that may not be the soul food of Leah Chase, both of them blessed memory, or Miss Cleora of Oklahoma, blessed memory, or Mama Dip of North Carolina of blessed memory. There were regional and important differences between how people festoon their Sunday dinner plates. So it's very important to understand that soul food isn't one thing. It's a family, a constellation of foods. And I actually happen to favor soul food, the construct, where we now have the invitation to take soul food beyond just these borders of this canon and move it into the ingredients and spices that came out of Nigeria, or Pan-African contemporary West African cuisine, or Caribbean favorites that mirror and are adjacent to Southern food. And kind of mix all that up in Afro-Latin food and just mix it all up and understand the underlying principles of feeling and flavor that really undergird Black foodways. It's really important to understand Southern cuisine in some ways as a cuisine of migrations. And this may apply to, for some of you, to your family history and family stories. Of course, the first thing is that we have to talk about indigenous people and how indigenous people moved across the face of North America in search of sustainable food and sustainable environments where the population could grow, they could have settlements. And in the Southeast in particular, there was a very refined culture of mound builders and eventually the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. And then Western Europeans coming out of Europe were looking for land and resources because Europe had been pushed to the brink. The population was growing out of control, resources were being used up. And then, of course, there's our folks, enslaved Africans, who are being brought from West Central and sometimes Southeastern Africa. And eventually the land will be worn out with some of the cash crops that are being grown in the Chesapeake region, in the Low Country in Piedmont, and the Gulf Coast and Lower Mississippi Valley, including Louisiana. And that forces people to move inward. European colonists will take enslaved Africans and intrude on those same Native American groups, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Choctaw, and beyond. And that forced migration means that not only the crops of and animals and ideas about food from West Central Africa and Southeastern Africa are moving to the early South, but those ideas are now moving beyond the coast into the interior and eventually on a westward direction towards Texas and beyond. That forced migration was called the domestic slave trade. And the domestic slave trade was interesting and important because it's now bringing all of those things that have been in development on the southeastern coast for 150 years. Now, to us, it's all the same, right? Because the past is the past. But here, you have these people who have lived in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and coastal Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, who are now pushing into the interior. And they're bringing with them the food of the Low Country, the food of the Chesapeake, the food of the Piedmont, the food of the Southern Appalachians. And that food goes over a wide swath of the Southern landscape. So to this day, you can find country ham, biscuits, people who are foraging for pokeweed, folks who are eating bear and turkey and venison, people who are cultivating turnip greens, and fried chicken is on a Sunday dinner. All of that comes from the fact that these same people who had come from the Chesapeake and the Piedmont and the Appalachians are now to be found in Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, the Ozarks, and beyond to upper Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. So people were growing rice and they were eating sweet potatoes. The food reflected more of those rice coast and Central African dishes, but also the foodways of the French and Spanish who settled the coast. Those things are going into the interior as well. And when those two food traditions meet, that becomes what we know today as contemporary Southern food culture. But it's the product of these migrations that are produced through avarice, through greed, through war, through geopolitics that go beyond the local need for biscuits and gravy. And it's that kind of complexity that we need to have as part of our conversation so you can understand that these are regional and local foodways that have a global heritage and global implications. So here's the deal. If you're a devotee of Southern cuisine, we have regional and cultural differences, and we have foods that have become a part of us. But there are certain ingredients, no matter where on the map I just located you, that are going to remain constants, and they're a part of that Afro-Atlantic, African-Atlantic culinary tradition. But do your homework. Think about the dishes that you love the most. Think about the things that you appreciate. Think about the states where they come from and how they fit into the dinner. Barbecue, fried chicken, jambalaya, gumbo, etouffee. The list goes on. But the bottom line is all of these foods have a very common origin in the nexus that was the transatlantic slave trade. Trace them out and then apply those narratives to the narratives from your family and your own personal experience with those foods and ingredients. It's really important for you to get a familiarity with some of these big names and get to the little names. Leah Chase was executive chef of the famous Creole restaurant Dookie Chase's in New Orleans, which at the time of the Civil Rights Movement was a safe haven for activists. Over in Alabama, Georgia Gilmore sold hundreds of plates of soul food that helped bail activists out of jail who were arrested during sit-ins. Zephyr Wright, chef to former President Lyndon Johnson, is said to have contributed to his decision about the Civil Rights Act. But here are two chefs that I feel have made the greatest personal impact on my journey in Southern cuisine. Edna Lewis, who was brought back into cultural awareness via Top Chef, was named the South's answer to Julia Child. She was known for championing the South's terroir, the same way that Julia Child popularized French cuisine. Edna's family, through the Great Migration, came from Freetown, a little hamlet in Virginia started by her grandparents, emancipated and formerly enslaved Black folks. So you see her cookbooks exploring her upbringing on the family farm, cooking with the ingredients and methods available to her. She rose to prominence long before people were talking about the importance of local eating and heritage foods. Edna Lewis was that champion at the moment when people were beginning to examine the roots and meaning of Southern cuisine. And through her work, Edna encouraged young people to come back to the land and farm and cook. And what's interesting is that Edna Lewis herself said, turn every stone. Don't just valorize me, because I ain't the only one. And she was right. She was just the one that had the book contract. There were hundreds of other Edna Lewises. One of them was my paternal grandmother from South Central Virginia, from a tobacco farm. So the very same foods that Edna Lewis talks about in her works, their autobiographical cookbooks, are the same foods that my grandmother cultivated and knew, and beyond. And there was a certain taste to those foods coming from that region. Edna, who lived in the 20th century into the 21st, was, of course, predated by other cooks. And one of the most famous was James Hemings, who didn't live and was born and lived not very far from Orange County, Virginia, where Edna Lewis is from, down in Albemarle County, which is a nearby county. The Hemings family was enslaved to Thomas Jefferson's family and his wife's family. In fact, they were inherited through his wife's line. Sally Hemings, with whom Jefferson has children, we won't even address that as an equal relationship because it was not. And her brother James, who became a chef, were the half-siblings of Jefferson's widow. So when we talk about the complexities of family, genealogy, and cooking, and all of that, I mean it. It is borne out through Southern history again and again. And James, like other Southern Black cooks were able to do, was trained outside of the South. He was trained in Paris. He comes back to America literate, multilingual, fluent in French, and basically, if we're gonna be real, the father of Southern gourmet cuisine. Why? Why do we even say that? Because he's taking those foods from Virginia and using French technique and recipes and combining those with the ones he knows at home. Patrick Henry famously said that the table of Thomas Jefferson is half Virginian and half French in style, served in good taste and abundance. Well, who was the cook? It was James Hemings, who was trained at the court, the French court at Versailles and the restaurants, the best restaurants and taverns in Paris. And the bottom line is that when Patrick Henry says Virginian, he really means African Virginian, because that's the lens and the hands through which that Virginia food came from. By the time James Hemings is this master chef in early America, Thomas Jefferson has already written a treatise called Notes on the State of Virginia.
Here he praises the exotic nature of our ancestors' banjos, while at the same time calling us an inferior people. He goes on to say that the gardens of Virginia yield muskmelons, watermelons, and okra, all African plants. His critique failed to note the many ways his own life was deeply impacted by the presence of Africans and the culture of West Africa.
He's talking about black-eyed peas and rice and how we Virginians. So when we say Virginia, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about foods and items and dishes that ultimately go back to Nigeria, what we call Nigeria, southeastern Nigeria, Biafra, the homeland of my Igbo ancestors, and beyond. So these two figures in their own times and spaces are just clear evidence of how Black American food is both part of this African Atlantic tradition and it's the roots of American food. James Hemings, in his own time, was probably the most best-trained chef that Federalist America knew, and knew the best of those worlds. He could read, he could write, he was multilingual, but he was still an African descendant in early America. And we could go on with multiple names, but that's your job, that's your assignment, to go find those people, to look at those cookbooks, to read those cookbooks with reverence, scriptural reverence for the people who wrote them. Because by telling us about their lives, they're telling you about the lives of your ancestors. When you have nothing else to go on, go to those works, go to those histories, go to those stories to find out the pieces that you were denied. Some people don't understand what African or African Atlantic foodways is. You know, quite frankly, in contemporary North America, the United States, we're just beginning to see Ghanaian restaurants. We're just beginning to see Nigerian restaurants. We've formerly only had Ethiopian restaurants, which is even the part of Africa where the majority of our ancestors came from. It's hard for people to put their finger on what is African food. And that's silly because, you know something, on the one hand, we know what we mean by African or African diaspora or Afro-Atlantic or African Atlantic. But for other people, it's literally Africa, as if someone, the reverse might be, I want some European food. How does that sound? Africa has more countries, it has more ethnic groups, it has more languages, and let's just be real about it. It has a longer human history than any other continent on Earth. So when we say African food, that's a really bland, vague, and vapid title for something that's really, specific as an ethnic group that lives in one spot or an ethnic group that lives in 20 countries. When it comes to the matter of Southern food, I think there are people who, you might know them, who they may not like us, but they like our food. They don't even know. I mean, a couple of years ago, the United Klans of America had a massive rally in North Carolina. Why did they go to a Black restaurant to get all the food for it? We've been making their food for 400 years. I guess they don't know the difference. So it's very difficult to sort of tease out what from what. Well, for example, in Louisiana, the French have gotten extraordinary credit for foods that have nothing to do with them. For example, the gumbo, the name literally comes from Kimbundu. Ochingombo is a word for okra in Angola. What does some type of gumbo have in it? Okra. But you still have books that are out there that claim that gumbo comes from bouillabaisse. If you've been to France and you really are the gourmet you say you are, you know that bouillabaisse don't taste nothing like no gumbo. For real. Chebu nyebe. Chebu nyebe literally means rice and cowpeas, black-eyed peas, which is the same food as Hoppin' John in South Carolina. And you have the same kind of food found in parts of Brazil and Latin America. And it's also called jambalaya con gris in Old New Orleans. We can talk about feijoada. In Brazil, black beans and rice. We can talk about moros y cristianos in Cuba. We can talk about arroz en guandules in Puerto Rico. The same principle of legume plus rice. But you know the difference? In Cuba and Brazil and Puerto Rico, there may be issues regarding race that go deep, that have been there for centuries. But nobody in those countries would ever claim that Africa ain't the mama. It's only in America where we still are wrestling with every aspect of the African presence and contribution that people have to dig deep and ask me 100 questions before they believe me. When I say a food that has this exact parallel in Senegal has an African origin. Barbecue. Babake in Hausa means to grill, to toast, to roast, to cook meat with an extraordinary amount of wood. I've shown people the dictionaries, the colonial dictionaries, where this word was hidden and locked away, and they still don't believe me. Despite the fact that all those images of those colonial antebellum black men cooking barbecue, that barbecue has anything to do with us. But because of the fact that black people have often been denied access to our contributions and acknowledgement from everything from Jack Daniels to beyond, it makes it even more important for us to reclaim these things. We're not reclaiming them out of some petty need to be important. This is ancestral honorance that we are engaging in. This is pride for our children. And it's also an invitation for people who do not look like us, or even more important, don't think like us, to understand the debt that the South owes to Africa. In the words of my chef brother, Michael Moore, a white Southerner from North Carolina who comes from the same counties that some of my ancestors came from, thank you, Africa. That's all that needs to be said. You know, when I went to Senegal, and if you go to the continent, you'll see this yourself. There's the way people eat in the West, individual plates. Everybody has their own thing to their taste. And then there's the way of eating in continental West Africa and beyond, where you share food from the same bowl. You better keep your hands clean. That's the first thing I'll ask. Your hands clean, examine your hands. And you sit with the family around the circle, around the common bowl, eating the rice, eating the fufu with the stew or the sauce that goes with it. The values of hospitality and generosity The feeling that you must give your guest plenty to eat, that, that they should be satisfied. I mean, those are the very roots of Southern hospitality right there. In Senegal and Gambia, it's called teranga, who are invested with this sort of generosity and openness, and that people feel welcome in your presence. That they are always taking care of their family. And so we don't have the same sort of cues. I mean, our food is not divided up into little courses, often a one-pot meal, or a starch and a stew, or a starch, a sauce, and a fried or grilled protein. And that's just that African way of eating. It's communal. There are some informalities, but there are also these grand efforts at making a show. And what's interesting about it is a lot of our eating isn't hierarchical, traditionally. In sub-Saharan Africa, one of the most startling features is the fact that royalty, kings, queens, eat their fufu and their rice and their sadza de posho the same way that the person who has almost nothing. Everybody wants that key staple. The only difference is our access to foreign foods, greater animal protein, and liquor. Those are the only things that set apart those diets. But for the most part, everybody has to start that meal with that fufu, that pounded yam, pounded cassava, pounded plantain, that corn mush, or that rice. And the common dishes and ingredients that go along with it that make up that culture's food, that culture's key staples are true to everybody, no matter how they rank in the society. What's so incredibly powerful about this whole complex of ideas about food is that it's remarkably similar from place to place. So there's jerk in Jamaica, and there's barbecue in the American South, and there's churrasco in Brazil. There are rice and bean dishes throughout the Caribbean, throughout the American South, and throughout South America. There are multiple versions of fried chicken in our world. And so you begin to see all these patterns. And it becomes evident that we have a family portrait, a family tree, that's made up of all these different foods that tell very deep and important stories. A peanut sauce here, a peanut candy there. All these things that point back to these people whose names, unfortunately, many have been irrevocably lost. But the dishes go on, and the names, Guba, from Angola, to mean a peanut. Okra, from Okuru, from Igbo, in eastern Nigeria. Banana, meaning the fruit of the same name, from Senegal. Kura, meaning the turtle that was turned to soup, from the Manding and the Congo. Kalilu, from Mandinka, from Gambia and Senegal. Those ancestors left names and traditions. Can you imagine those women from different parts of Africa who would never have met each other on the continent, all of a sudden now on the plantations of Jamaica and South Carolina and the Barbados now have to sit together, and they all make okra soup. Every single Black country in the Americas makes okra soup. And these women from Senegal, Angola, and Ghana had to sit down together and say, how are we gonna pass something on to our children that remind them that they ain't of here, that they have a mother, and that mother is Africa, and that mother is our mother. And even though we come from different places, it was the same boat that made different stops. And it's that kind of magical moment of perseverance and survival that makes this food so explosively powerful. And I want to make sure that you know that. I want to make sure that you understand that our tradition is not simple. Our tradition is not comforting and easy. Our tradition is about love weaponized as heritage. I will never forget, y'all, going to a space, I think it was in Capernaum, in Israel, Palestine, and it was one of the villages and one of the towns that Jesus walked through. And there was a Roman household, right, with a mosaic. And these patrician Romans would have a mosaic on the floor that, counterintuitive to what we might think, was an artistic representation of them throwing all their scraps on the floor. You know, I'm so bling and I'm so rich that I can afford to have lobster and murex shells and bones of animals and scraps of vegetables. And they would put it actually in the mosaic on the floor to show their status. I looked at that and I said, that's just like our history, right? As diaspora people, as oppressed and marginalized people. Like, I may not be able to tell you that these are all the different parts of the elephant in the mosaic, but there's a tusk and there's a leg and there's a that. So I know there was an elephant here. And in the same way, that's how I approach piecing together the genealogy and family history and oral tradition and our folklore, as well as the documents, what people wrote and they saw. But it's like a mosaic. You only get that's broken or that's interrupted, destroyed. You know what the mosaic is depicting and what some of the parts are, but you don't always know what the full picture is. When you approach this through the lens of genealogy, and you want to include that in your food writing and your story making and just finding out more information about yourself and your family's culinary traditions. And some people really don't ask that many questions. It's just accepted on surface value. So for example, if I knew nothing else, I would tell you, okay, I guess I'm Black American. My grandparents were from Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia. That's all I know. You know, some were landowners, some were sharecroppers. And then they went to work in the city. Then they went through the Great Migration to other parts of the country. And I guess that's it. They were Protestant, Christian in the Black church. They said they were part Native. They knew they were part white. And I guess they came from Africa. Some of them, I don't know when, blah, blah, blah. Now I know the answer to these questions, so I have a very different perspective. So I'm speculating on where they come from, whether or not their stories are true. That's speculative genealogy. I guess we are from, we live in Paramus, but we're actually from Sicily. Okay, what does that actually mean? When? Why? Who came over? Acknowledging, for example, that for Italian Americans, a number of Italian immigrants actually came here, worked, and went back to Italy. Another state, why did they make that choice? Why did American Jews from Poland, which wasn't just Poland, it was Galicia, it was Russian Poland. Why did some people come over before the Shoah, the Holocaust, and others after? Black people, there's Caribbean immigration happens long before the independence of Caribbean states from the British Empire. And there are those that come after. And they form different communities in different spaces with different names for different reasons. All of that stuff matters. So it's the context that informs our speculative genealogy about where we come from, why are we here. Genetic genealogy is very complicated because you are now using the tool of DNA, which is still pretty much in some forms of its infancy, to sort of divine more about where you have been as a family. And that term is relative as well because you are an individual. You're actually just acknowledging your own individual genes over the past 500 to 1,000 years. And then there are other tests that do deep ancestry if you really want that story. But now tests are going down in cost, and it's wise and advisable to do multiple tests because a lot of them also connect you with other people who may share genetic ancestry with you, who may have pictures or evidence or documents or stories that you need to complete your own genealogical story. That's critical. But also, we have more people telling those narratives that help us contextualize our own story. For example, long before I knew anything about my own family history with Sierra Leone, with the Mende and other ethnic groups, people were talking about the connection between Sierra Leone and the Gullah Geechee people and other Carolinians and Georgians. And so now we know that about a quarter of all the people that came to the Carolinas and Georgia were from Sierra Leone, Liberia, and neighboring countries. They were predominantly rice growers who also knew how to grow cotton and indigo as well, and were cultivating many of the foods that we consider key foods and soul food today, and Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian food. And because we have that narrative and that story, which is so beautiful and so important, many more of us can visualize and understand where we come from. I'm not a scientist. I'm just somebody who uses genetic genealogy as a means to verify oral history and contextual history. And for the most part, in my own narrative, it's been fairly successful. But you also have to do the mental gymnastics to determine what that means for you. Because again, the lab cannot tell you that you're white or black or brown or mixed or whatever. It can't tell you your nationality or your ethnicity. Those are human constructions and choices. That's not what the science is looking at. The science is looking at gene pools labeled after different places in peoples. But if you can look at your genealogy through the lens of strict documentation, speculation, and genetics, you have the opportunity to look at your own family story and the story that you're going to pass on in a sort of multi-layered level that gives you a deeper appreciation for your version of the human story. One of the things that comes up a lot is that people have this strange sort of like surprise that they have European ancestry if you're African American or an African descendant in the Americas. Not all of us have it. In fact, it'd be even more surprising if you had next to none or no European ancestry. That's rare. So for some of us, it's easy to see that there has been mixing with European folk in our families. It doesn't always mean that there was some kind of abusive relationship, but most of the time during slavery, that's what happened. For some people, your ancestors were European indentured servants, and that's very old ancestry. That's not totally uncommon. I think about 2% of us have a situation where they have a white female maternal ancestor. And what that means is that your ancestor was a white woman who lived during the time period during the 17th century when it was not illegal for whites and blacks to be married in Christian marriage. Then later on, the law was changed to discourage black men and white women from marrying, and further made the offspring of any such marriage immediately enslaved or indentured, depending upon what state and locality you ran. But otherwise, I mean, it's a pretty safe guess. If you're a Louisiana Creole, having French, Spanish ancestry is a high likelihood. If you are a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and the Hemings family, that may be a reality for you. But I think that what's most important here is to acknowledge that just because that this genetic genealogy said that you're part European, whiteness and blackness is really in your head. It's up to you. And of course, the society leering at us. The society leering at us is Nazi, sort of black, brown-ish, mixed-ish. It still operates according to what we inelegantly call the one-drop rule. So I can't tell you how to view your own sense of identity if you have European or even Asian Native American ancestry. Being a little bit of Native doesn't make you indigenous. Like being a little bit of black doesn't make you black. Those are all social and cultural constructs. And they also sometimes have legal definitions that are beyond our ken or control. But what I can say is this: having non-African ancestry as an African descendant in the Americas and beyond is an opportunity to educate other people about the realities of our long relationship with each other in American history. And it's an opportunity to remind people that family comes in all colors. I'm going to speak to folks of African descent right now. I'm talking to you. First of all, there are very few services that can so-called tell you your tribe, okay? Tribe is a loaded word. Ethnic group is a little bit better, but not always precise, but who your people are. These are peoples, these are ethnic groups, these are families of people who share clan affinity and ethnic attachment, like language, customs, rituals, all of which make them a cohesive group. Some services, people are addicted to the pie chart. They like that pie chart that's very colorful. That tells them, I'm this much percentage this. What you have to remember as an African descendant is that it takes multiple tests to really kind of figure out who you are. Some services have actually declined in their usability, unfortunately, as of us talking with each other. Some services, and I won't name names, used to connect people with a smaller centimorgan, a smaller genetic connection with each other who were relatives. So for example, one service was connecting us with our blood relatives from Africa. But sometimes, those are very old and small pieces of genetic material. But what's cool is if you have it and your cousin has it, another cousin has it, you're pretty much assured that that person you've connected with is a relative. And I will tell you this much. Those of you who are continental Africans and Afro-Caribbeans and Afro-Latin descendants, please, if you're comfortable, get your DNA done. You know why? Because if the connection is strong, you will be able to connect a descendant in the Americas with their Caribbean or African roots. I've seen it. It's a beautiful thing. I had a mentor, and I was talking with my mentor, and her husband, who was also a mentor of mine, I didn't realize had passed away. And she mentioned that he got his DNA done, and she asked him, You're Sarah and Wola from Senegal. You know where you come from. Why are you doing this? And he said, I want to make sure that people on this side of the ocean know where they come from. And she said, okay. Come to find out that one of my distant cousins who I met through this genetic genealogy search has ancestry from Mount Vernon, the plantation that George Washington owned. He knows the exact ancestor, what his name was when he was born. And that particular part of Virginia had an enormous amount of people who came from Senegambia. And one of those connecting ancestors was the genes of my mentor with my distant cousin. And he asked me one day, do you know Gorgie, this Gorgie fellow from Senegal? Do you know of these people? Like I would know them. Do you know that? And I said, I only know one, and that's him. And when I talked to his widow, it was him. People who had never met each other. One person I knew in my 20s, another person I met in my late 30s and 40s. And now all the pieces were there. It gives people an opportunity to make this reconnection that was never supposed to happen. Remember this, you were never supposed to know where you came from. Their names, your origin, nothing. You were never supposed to know these stories. It was supposed to have been beaten out of you 300 years ago so that somebody else could feel superior to you, so that someone else could rob you of your opportunity to have the sense of confidence that comes from knowing who you are. And now that we have the opportunity to fix and repair, when possible, not always, that's an essential part of our process. One DNA test will tell you your haplogroup. Another will not. One DNA test will tell you the closest ethnic group that matches who you are. You need to understand that in West Africa, Nigeria is a nation of 300 plus ethnic groups. And by the way, some of them have been mixing and marrying for centuries. It's very possible to have DNA from an ethnic group that is found in every single country in West Africa, like the Fulani, the Fulbe, the Pool. Notice I've used already 3 different names for a group that has more names than that. But they're the same ethnic group. So you have to familiarize yourself with the ethnonyms or ethnic names, and they differ based on region, based on who colonized them. And then there are people like the Congo who were one big polity but had different sub-ethnic groups within the ethnic group. So I'm part Sundi, which is a very specific part of the Congo, Angola region. 1/3 of us are of Central African origin, as well as West African origin. So having that roots from Congo, there's a connection there. And note that the boat didn't just stop here. I noticed I had cousins in Haiti, in, what you call Haiti, in Brazil, in Jamaica, in Guatemala, in Belize. And then I realized something. The boat was separating these families, father from son, mother from daughter, brother from brother, sister from sister, in different places in the Americas. So when we call each other brother and sister, that means something. That's not slang, that's spirit. You need to know that you have family in other parts of the Black Atlantic world. You need to understand that that's, I didn't know till very recently that in the past 150 years, I have recent Afro-Caribbean ancestry, which is fun because for at least 2 years, the Jamaicans and the Trinidadians, the Trinis, and the Bajans argued over which Caribbean I would be. And then Team Trinidad got me. But that's part of the thrill of it, right? Is once you know these new pieces of yourself, and that you've kind of, if you see a consistent, repetitive result, you can probably bet that it's there. And also do the history work. Now a lot of historians have done a good amount of work on where people came from and to based on the database of the transatlantic slave trade. So those of us who are African Virginian have noticed we have a lot of Southeastern Nigerian, Southwestern Cameroon in us. And those of us who are South Carolinian, a lot of Sierra Leone and Congo. And those of us who are from Louisiana, a lot of Senegal, a lot of Benin, and a lot of Congo and Haitian in us. There's a reason for that, because that's who came to those places based on the historical records we have of the slave trade. And that's an even further comment on where your people came from. And then you start looking at the maps, right? Because you know what this does for you? It puts you and your children in touch with world geography, with geopolitics, with a larger sense of self. When you think that you only come from this corner, this hood, this area, this little niche, this little cut, that's a far different reality than when you know that you're a global citizen. And that requires a very different form of cultural literacy and self-confidence and acceptance and awareness. So for me, it was looking at that map of Nigeria and going, wow, my cousins come from this particular state in eastern Nigeria. And I looked it up on the internet and I said, well, how long does it take to walk? And I was just blown away by the fact that it was 4 days walk from the villages where they would have lived to the port of Bonny and Old Calabar, where the British ships from Liverpool picked them up and took them to the Chesapeake. And then I went to that spot in Yorktown, where about half of the 100,000 Africans who disembarked in Virginia were brought to. And I was able to stand on that spot with the historical marker, and it's called the Great Valley. And I knew at this spot, This is where they would have gotten off the slave ship, been walked up the hill, prepared for market, and sold in Yorktown and Williamsburg, and then later Richmond. And that does something to you. Because at that point, you're not the stories that people tell about you. You're the stories that you get to decide where they begin, where they end, and where they matter. Another piece is knowing the context of the law and the context of records. For a lot of African Americans, the year 1870 is really critical because the 1870 census was the first census in which African Americans were a completely non-enslaved people who could be recorded on their own and in their own right. You know, one of the indignities and disparities during enslavement was that they had slave schedules, by the way. And those slave schedules had plenty of space on the paper to record the names of our ancestors along with their color, their sex, and their age. But nobody ever did. And what's so sad about that is that if only we had all of those census records with just the names of our ancestors, we could go so much further. But instead, we're left to guess which person was who based on who they were supposedly owned by and why and when. So the 1870 census, if you have somebody who was long-lived or still had parents or grandparents that was living, you can bounce back to the 18th century. But for most of us, we only get as far as the 1820s or 1810s, which, although extremely important, doesn't give us the same American story or access to the same American story that other people do, which is why in my work, and you may do this in your own, I use a lot of genetic genealogy to help fill in the gaps. But these are the boundaries and the limitations and the circles around our own, genealogical story. You may ask, well, what is food writing? How do we define that? Food writing, for me, is basically non-fiction narratives and memoirs. It's cookbooks. It's culinary history, which is a major part of my career. Food writing can be writing about social issues in food. So, for example, cultural appropriation or access to food, food justice, culinary justice. It can also be talking about food and gender, which is a subject that is sorely needed to be discussed further. Food writing is anything you really want it to be as long as food is somewhere in the nexus of what you're talking about. Food writing is this one of many ways to talk about the world. Food democratizes. So it makes it possible for you, if you want to be a food writer, to really talk about it. But you have to talk about it in a responsible way. You have to be accurate. You have to be clear. You have to look at food and talk about it as if the person was right there, but they're not. So your words have to do the work of sitting at the kitchen table with them the way you are with me right now. So that's what food writing is. Food writing is engaging with people through words about food in a way that moves them to think about this thing that is in their life every day, several times a day, and constantly around them, that forces them to think about who they are on every single level. Okay, so how do you go about some kind of massive project like this? So some of you may just sit here and go, I don't even know my great-grandparents' names, or I know roughly where they came from. Let's say someone was Croatian, but had never been to Croatia. They knew a little bit about the food or whatever, and they knew maybe someone who came over on the boat, but nothing about the family in Croatia. So it's incumbent upon you to learn everything you can about Croatia and where Croatian Americans went and what kind of jobs they had and where they lived and the foods that survived. People don't let go of certain things. Food is a huge and important element. So you start with whatever was at your table. For some people, their ethnic heritage consists of 5 to 10 dishes, and that's about it. Usually these are very comforting dishes, very rich dishes you would have on special occasions. Not necessarily the everyday food. Then sometimes the everyday food, which is really the soul food of the people, survives. So you start there. You start researching those dishes. And you ask the question, why did my group make those things? Here's an assignment for you. Sketch your life out in meals. It doesn't have to be every single year. That would be nice if you could do that. For some of you, that may be a bit of a test. Not just in terms of memory, but in terms of giving away all your tea. So what I want you to do is say, for example, this year was such and such, I remember, and I ate this, and talk about the table or the party or the reunion or the wedding or the funeral, whatever it was. Tell your life story in meals. Just do 10. Just do 10. Take 10 years across the entire spectrum of your life. Talk about the colors in the room. When I was very young, it was the late 70s and early 80s. So everything was avocado and mustard and salmon, all these other god-awful pastels, And that's just the way it was. And really bad geometric floral patterns and brutalist architecture. And that did influence, I think, for me, the way the food felt, the way it tasted, the world around me, right? Do that for yourself. Tell me all about how your life has changed, has evolved, has returned to its original spaces based on meals and food. What do you miss? What do you not miss? I know people who can't eat a bite of rabbit because it's all they eat growing up, because it was cheap and available and could be hunted. I know people who used to be vegetarian but are now omnivore. People who used to be carnivores are now vegetarians and vegans. What got you there? How did you get there? That's really the big question. How did you get here? Where are you going? Tell me through food. I guess at this point you're thinking, how do I do this immense project? How do I not only do what you did, but maybe even go beyond it and go other places, tell other stories? Well, the first problem is, where are the relatives? Where are the family? Where are the friends of the family that are going to be able to provide you the past, the stories of the past, the narratives that you need? And it's so important to latch on to whoever can tell you the stories you're not going to get anywhere else immediately. Don't hesitate. Do not wait on ceremony to gather those narratives. So one thing I want you to do, and a big assignment, is to go to the eldest people who are able to tell you the stories that answer your questions. And sometimes the elders that you're going to find, you may not have any grandparents left, or you may not have any great-grandparents left. Or they may not be able to tell you what you need. Talk to their siblings. Talk to people they go to worship with. Talk to people they grew up with. Ask questions. Ask questions of nieces and nephews, because remember, children are often the little memory banks of the family. And they see things and know things that sometimes we or others forget. In other words, your human resources, and remember, memory is fallible. It's not always going to give you an exact portrait of things. It will always be subjective and skewed. So that's why you need to interview more than one person. You also need to interview yourself. Take this assignment seriously. Write down everything you remember, every sensory impression, sight, sound, taste, smell, words you heard, traditions that you didn't understand, they were always around, that intrigued you. And then do your homework. Look up the work of people who have done research on the folklore and food lore of your folks, your kinfolk, your region, your state, your ethnic group, your corner of the African Atlantic, whatever, and connect the dots. That's where it's exciting. That's where you're gonna be the most inspired. When you do all this work and it's kind of drudgery and it's kind of just a process, then all of a sudden your eyes pop open because you heard somebody say something that you did or you grew up with that you didn't hear anywhere else, and you go, how do you know that? And then you might even find out, well, when we did this, this is what would happen. There would always be, and then all of a sudden, you've located a part of a tradition, a story, that magic that you can't get in a book until you write the book, you know? So you have to do that work. You have to do the research through people. You have to document it. You have to write it down. You have to record it. You have to upload it to a cloud. You have to remember, insecurity is your friend. Vulnerability is your friend. If you think it's gonna die with you and it'll always be forgotten, then you will take the precautions to make sure it doesn't die. You'll make sure that it's eternal. And that's what's gonna happen. When I'm writing about sugar, I have to remind my reader that sugar is the reason why I, as a Black man, am in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, speaking English to you at this moment. Because thousands of years ago, a woman, because women were probably the inventors of agriculture, stumbled upon a reed that had water in it. And the water tasted really good. And that reed was sugarcane. And then that reed, which becomes part of the genealogy of Papua New Guinea, the indigenous people there, spreads across the world. But as it spreads across through migration, through trade, through war, it eventually becomes this crop that becomes the central driver of the transatlantic slave trade. So every time that I sit down to a table and there are packets of sugar, my historian brain works like this, and my personal engagement works like this. Sugar is this choice of addiction that we've been making for thousands upon thousands of years, and it morphs. So when we write about health issues in sugar, or we write about the pleasures of sugar, to me, it's always bound up in that history. So I'm thinking about this one ingredient on multiple levels. It's great, it's horrible, it's this, it's that. And my job is to tease out a message, a theme, and then get it to the reader based on which one of those prevailing thoughts I have about sugar or any other ingredient. For me, the history of the ingredient's important to some extent. To me, the personal stories are important. Times when I had self-doubt, or times when I didn't like myself for overindulging. Times when that was the only thing that would make me feel happy. So communicating this in a vulnerable kind of way is my process, really going deep into myself. And you'll know when you have your own personal boundaries, when you have to stop and say, okay, maybe I've gone too far. Maybe I don't want everybody to know that about me or know how I think about this, and that's okay. What you really have to do is figure out what are the lines, what are the boxes, what are the circles that you're willing to express yourself with. Do you go further out of that? How much history do you want to divulge? So for me, that's the process. It's a little bit of research. It's a little bit of reflecting about the role that a food or a cultural item of food, a cuisine, a genre of cooking, a food media, how does it make me feel? And how does it make others feel? Asking the questions. Lots of people want to know, how do you start a blog? What's your blog about? Why do you have that blog? Every blog is a different story. When people write blogs about food, they're very formulaic in many cases. You do a recipe, there's pretty pictures, there's food porn, and people leer into your kitchen space and they see, the backsplash and the marble or the granite countertops or whatever you choose to do. I hear that the granite's out and marble's in, but I ain't paying for no marble.
The point is, you don't need to have a fancy kitchen or be a trained chef to write about food or work with food. All that matters is having a passion for sharing your experiences with the wider world.
So the first thing that I did was I took myself to the movie theater. And I saw a certain movie about a certain food blogger and her relationship with Julia Child. And I sat in that movie theater and watching these two white women, I went, okay, I know the food world is full of white women, and I'm not a white woman. And I don't know how I'm gonna fit into a world where I don't really see myself as a Black man, let alone a Black gay Jewish man from the South. And so I had to figure out a way to say, how does my story fit? How do I matter? Why do I matter? And after I was able to do that work for myself, I just started writing down my own food narratives. And I realized I already had this sort of experience interviewing people and talking to people, and I really had a passion for this ancestral wisdom. And so that was the first thing. You don't think of yourself as starting at that moment. Think of yourself as starting at the first time you sat down at the table and you had a transformative food experience. It doesn't have to be great, and that's important. It isn't about, happy endings. It isn't about happy stories. It's about stories that move you, but more importantly, stories that move others. You want to be in a space where the words you put on paper move everybody. And when I say move, I mean make them angry, make them sad, make them laugh, make them think. And the most important element to this is that you have to be willing to be wrong, to make mistakes, and to write terribly. You can't sit there and think, oh my God, if I'm just gonna write these words down, it's gonna be perfect and effortless. That's not how this works. People asking about Afro-Culinaria and how did I start it, why did I start it? I guess the reason why people start blogs, the reason why I started a blog, was because in our day and time, it's the most democratic way to get your voice out there. I mean, I come from a space where if you wanted to talk about food in any sort of intellectual way, you had to be established in journalism, you had to be an academic. And when it came to talking about Black food, and Black people's food, people weren't talking about the people who made it, what the values behind the food. It was as if, much like other things that our people do, it's all about, the results, but never about the process. It's never about the brains behind the art. It's as if the art is always instinctual and dare I say, bestial. And I didn't like that. I wanted to restore the humanity, talking about, for me in particular, the ancestors of our food, our folks in Africa, our kinfolk in Africa and the Caribbean and beyond, in Brazil and Haiti, and our enslaved ancestors. And I remember someone immediately pushing back and saying, oh, this is all well and nice and well and good and all, but it's about the food. Talk about the food, man. That was the email that I got. And I immediately said no, because you're so used to hearing about our cultural productions, but you don't know our names. You don't know how life is for us, about our homes, about the values that we have, about the way our kitchens look, about the expressions, about when the times that we invest and our spiritual rainbow and diversity. You don't know any of those things about us. You just want the recipe and run. Everybody wants to sing our blues, but nobody wants to live our blues. And so for me, Afro-Culinaria was about creating a space where I could begin to tell stories that were not being told about food and Black people. It's cool to have everybody write about, oh, this Black person in food, that Black person in food from the past. But I remember when that wasn't a thing, when people were like, no, we don't care. Like for our folks, they were like, that's interesting. But, Black history and the knowledge of Black culture was often treated as a hobby or trivial, as opposed to an actual knowledge system, which it is. And I wanted to convey that. I grew up in a multicultural community, East Coast. The kids I went to school with were Iranian and Hmong and Vietnamese and Cambodian and Greek and Italian American and Lebanese and Korean and beyond. And there was always this sense of reverence about the culture and where people came from, and that you had to know another language to sort of delve into that. And I kind of grew up with a little bit of resentment because I never saw that sort of respect given to my culture and where I came from, even when we built this damn country for free. And the people who built this country had cultures. And even when we lost part of our cultures that we came from, we built a new culture. I was tired. Tired is not the word, exhausted. With people always presenting me narratives of if I was any good, it was despite my Blackness. If I was any good, it was despite being a Black American. If I was any good, it was despite being an African American. You know, the idea that Black people were a people of pathology. That everything we did was somehow sinful, evil, backwards, primitive, wrong, ignorant, arrogant, foolish, capricious. And I was like, no, that's not how this works. You know, you may not be able to go past 2 generations in Italy off a boat that came to Ellis Island. But I came through Sullivan's Island, outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And the very fact that I'm here and able to write about it and read about it is the first miracle, coming from generations of forced illiteracy. On pain of death, right? We will sell you, we will punish you, we will torture you, we will kill you for being able to read and write your own name. So that's the first miracle right there, is that I wanted to be able to talk about our story, my story as an African American. I mean African American. But what's amazing to me is what happens after that, what we make of our freedom. And what I've made of my freedom is being able to put the pieces back together as best I can. You have to be willing to go into the positive and negative aspects of your family history and journey if you really want to do this work. But if you're going to go there and look at it eyes open, remember, oju inu, open mind, open stomach, open eyes. You have to confront some things. And for us, you know, I remember growing up with a grandmother who was the color of my palm. And understanding ostensibly that she was Black, but we didn't look like other Black people. I remember asking my grandmother when I was very little, "Grammy, are you white?" And my grandmother was thoroughly pissed off at me. And I was little, I didn't understand. She didn't say a word to me for 2 days. And I cried because my grandmother was my best friend, the person I think other than my mom and daddy, who I love the most. And I didn't understand, and no one would explain to me why that question hurt her. It's because I didn't understand that every time my grandmother looked in the mirror or pictured her mother or her mother or her mother, she saw sexual violation. When you're little, you don't know what these things are, and you shouldn't. But, you know, I noticed that for other people, they paint us with a broad brush as Black people, but they don't even understand. What's it like to look in the mirror and know that you've been genetically modified because somebody had no impulse control, because somebody looked at their human property and saw them as a sexual object, and then looked at their own child and decided, you are not just a child I made, you are a product, you are a commodity. I can sell you and make money off of you. That's something we can't just ignore and shove in the, I don't know if I want to talk about this drawer. So in a world where we talk about valuing family, what does it mean that there are these millions of descendants of the Europeans who went to not just the Black community, but the indigenous community, the Asian community, other spaces, who made these children, these descendants, who were also their personal commodity. You know, the human race is not just skin deep. And to know the foods of those places as well, there's a part of me that goes, okay, I guess I have to tell these stories. And there's another part of me that goes, I'm glad I come from the people that invented pasta, right? And if they're all my family, then despite the past, which I still I wrestle with, and I expect others to wrestle with and do justice and be just to each other, then I have to treat everybody I meet, stranger, friend, and foe, as if they could be my blood. And that, for me, is the ultimate meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself. One of the things that I deal with in being so vulnerable is that you have to have pushback and feedback that doesn't always valorize what you do. And this is a very tough subject. So, for example, people will respond in ways that question your motive for doing something. For me, I remember writing about going to the grave of one of my ancestors who was the ancestor of the enslaver that had a child with my great-grandmother, who in fact was a teenage girl. She was not a full-grown woman. And I didn't do that in a way that celebrated that. I write about how confused and how detached I felt and how I didn't feel any sort of spiritual or genetic connection. It was just a fact. And someone responded, well, I had to put his book down because he focused too much on his enslaver ancestors, and it's obvious he never shook the anti-Blackness he grew up in. I'm like, excuse me? Did you do this work? Were you in these spaces? Have you had to confront your own genetic and genealogical legacy? Have you been to the continent? Do you know your name before they took it from you? Because I do. No, I didn't just do this work so I could write a book. I did this work so that I could be healed, so I could stop being in that hamster wheel of identity that tells the Black man and Black woman in America that they are orphans of the West and orphans of Africa, which we are neither. We're our own thing, on our own terms, in our own space, in our own way. And I am so sorry that you don't want to confront the fact that there is a white man in your woodpile. And that's just how it works. Just like there's a lot of white Southerners don't want to confront the fact that there is an African. There's more than one African in theirs. The folks on this side who don't want me to talk about that who are Black, and the folks on this side who are white who don't acknowledge I talk about it at all, their angst and their energy, just like anybody who has negative response to your work and some of the personal things you reveal, it comes from a place of not wanting to show that vulnerability. It comes from a place of not wanting to tell those truths. It comes from a place of not wanting to engage with things that are obvious facts in front of us every single day, but that we refuse to talk about. It's not your problem. What we have to do is understand ourselves. And so for me, that's been my dictum going forward, is those issues that shape us, that potato famine, that Holocaust, that slave trade, that Vietnam War. That's only part of the puzzle. But in confronting the issues that come off of that, we become better because we understand what it took to get us here. And then we know if that's in your gene pool, if that's in your genetic story, that's in your spiritual story, then you can overcome it all because you already have it in you. And so the book emerged out of that and other experiences, me confronting the legacy of slavery, me confronting the legacy of what used to be called miscegenation, so-called race mixing. We're all one human race, so that's really not what went down. Me confronting the legacy of being from these absolutely honorable people from Africa and these survivors and creators that became African American and Afro-Creole. Writing, for me, should feel therapeutic. And I think for many of you, it should do the same. In other words, I remember there was this saying that, the cure for writer's block is the pain of not being able to write. That you really, if you don't do this, it's worse than writing nothing at all. It's not writing. It's not putting things out of you. It's not expressing yourself creatively. It's like a person walking back and forth, banging at the walls of my head going, let me out. And then the words are on the page, and then I feel better. I feel healed. Or sometimes when I'm writing, particularly at night or early in the morning, right before the sun comes up, it's as if I'm talking with a therapist. Because I do write about a lot of things that involve not necessarily trauma, but healing from trauma, or the fact that history has its own traumas, or it might be something dealing with grief or dealing with a new opportunity that scares you, that's beautiful, but it scares you. And other times, something, it's helpful for you to have someone around you who you can bounce ideas off of or have a conversation with while you transcribe those thoughts into your computer or write out by hand. That's also very helpful. The main thing is to be present. You want to be present. You want to have all of those synapses firing. And I do this weird thing when I'm writing where if I think I've nailed it, I instinctively snap my fingers. Like I know, I hit the end of a sentence and I go, that's it, that's it. That's where it should be, and I can move on. That's a very good feeling because, as you well know, this isn't just about writing, it's about rewriting. If you haven't been told that already, sorry. If you didn't hear it from me, you're gonna hear it from somebody else. Writing is rewriting. Writing is reframing. Writing is rephrasing until you get it right. Food justice is something you may have heard about. And food justice is very specific. It's about food as a human right, and it's about food as healthy and sustainable food, having access to it. Culinary justice is a little bit different because when you say culinary, we're not talking about all matters food. We're talking specifically about ideas about food, ideas about cuisine, ideas about how food should be ordered, served, prepared, the rules around how food looks, who it's given to, and its meaning, and its value. I've spoken in this class about hierarchy and food and the African tradition. So we have these one-pot meals and foods that are not necessarily, high-value, prestige ingredients, but they're made in a certain way that's very comforting and very accessible. And those foods have attained a large measure of value in American foodways. If all you have is rice and beans, and somebody jacks your rice and beans and turns it into a gourmet $20 plate, and here you are in your hood, in your area, in your niche, in your cut, and this is your cultural creation, but you can't make anything off of it. It's not empowering you. You don't have the power, the platform, the privilege. Then you do need some culinary justice. Because at any point in time, those foods that we've created, whether it's hot chicken or chopped cheese or whatever, those foods have been reappropriated to fit a high-end market. And therefore, and many times, not only does the food leave us, but the ideas about the food and its meaning and its import and its cultural significance leaves us. So it's so critical for us to be able to delineate culinary justice. And it's not just about appropriation. That's only one aspect. One of the more important aspects of culinary justice is this idea that the people who create it deserve to have the ability to empower themselves from it, and that we give credit where credit is due. And that we also acknowledge the complex networks that create the arguments and meaning and import of those foods. We have to have that context. We have to have that information that tells us why that food and its connection to a people is so central to telling their story and connects that story to other elements of justice issues that they face. One of the buzzwords that we often hear about is cultural appropriation. There's an incredible pushback against it. And it's interesting because that's, why is the pushback there predominantly when we make the argument against taking those influences without any sort of hint at attribution, any sort of hint at acknowledgement, any sort of hint at reciprocity. And it really does come from a space of thinking that because we came from these enslaved people whose labor and whose contributions were taken for free. Remember, if the enslaved person, man or woman, invented something during the antebellum period or innovated something, the white man or woman by law got the credit. They could literally put their name on an invention by an enslaved person because an enslaved person wasn't by law a person. An enslaved person was 3/5 of a human being, chattel property. And so you ask a people to cool it, to cut it, that it's BS, that imitation is a form of flattery. But in this culture, in this society where you can't even steal an inch of somebody's land without there being a legal dispute, where you can't steal a word from a song, unless, of course, it was Black artists during the mid-20th century, where crossover was a means of stealing the rhythm, the beat, and the lyrics without paying those people a fair wage. The bottom line is, no, we have to have a better conversation about how we interact with each other, especially when we know that the culture of Black and brown people is commodified, is valuable, from food down to videos on social media containing dances. And so the first and foremost thing is to figure out a way to remind people that there is no sin in inspiration. There is no sin in sharing. But there is a sin in using power, platform, and privilege to sort of denude the creators of their worth and value. And so because of all of that, the thing we need to do is remember that we have the source code, okay? But owning the source code is what my work tries to do. And that's why I wanted to inspire you to do your own work. Because if we're in a space where we talk about where our people come from, where they come from, the stories, people can't copy that. They can't dare copy it. That's why it's so important to know about where our dances come from, about our language, about our spiritual ideas, about things that have been cloaked and covered in layers and layers and layers of masks, you know? The African tradition has a lot about masks and masquerading. Well, what do masks do? Masks are not some decorative way to make a dance or a performance more entertaining. In our tradition, they're the actual face of the ancestors. They're covering power so that power is not misused. A mask is not a performance piece. A mask is a lens. A mask is a protective cover. And so having that source code is like having that mask. And for generations, we had to do things that made very powerful and important parts of our culture seem silly or trendy, but they were really tradition. And part of that was to protect the power and the information. But now we live in a very different world where things are shared much faster, where things can pass out of the hands of our culture very easily. And the basic solution is to have so much self-knowledge, so much self-empowerment, so much personal awareness of one's own connection that no matter what anybody else tries to do, you always have that source code. You always have the code to that lock that says you can ape it, you can be inspired by it, but it will never be outside of the realm of the meaning that our ancestors and ourselves imbue it. And that's why you have to go so deep on the food knowledge, so deep on the spiritual knowledge, so deep on the knowledge of our oratory and our philosophy. because then it crowds out any possibility that someone with an alternative agenda can enter and spoil the narrative. One of the things that we all need to be aware of, and I would challenge you to do this in your own searching, is to look at an area of the South, another area where your ancestors came from, right? And ask questions about the land, the trees, the soil, what grows there, what can't grow there. And also think about how the environment has changed over time. This is so critical. For example, one area that I went to in Louisiana, near Darlingtonville, Louisiana, has some amazing disparities. Number one, they still grow acres and acres of sugarcane there. On the other end, there are these chemical plants. And that part of the South is unfortunately and truthfully known as Cancer Alley.
So this is an 85-mile-long stretch of land, and here resides a majority of African Americans who are the descendants of the enslaved who grew the sugarcane. These people are now at a 95% greater risk of cancer from air pollution than most of the United States. Not only that, but a century and a half after slavery, this place is a devastating food desert where fast food options outnumber access to fresh produce and nutritious food.
So how is it that our ancestors, with the Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia and other organizations bearing down on them like a wolf, were able to figure out ways to thwart that system so that people didn't have to rely on people who didn't have their best interests at heart to feed them? So really think about how areas where your family is from have changed. It's really surprising how some of the places that were once the source of produce that was fresh every day, fish from the water, birds from the air, livestock raised on all organic sources, have now been poisoned because environmental racism is real. And environmental change is based on who lives where and who has the money and what elected officials do and what choices they make with corporations. All of those things matter. And this systemic problem is ultimately tied to patterns that were started when the domestic slave trade and antebellum slavery set up a system that was not fair or righteous towards the Black man and woman. One thing I want to share with you is that it can be really disconcerting and really disturbing to see the degree to which other folks, growers of other backgrounds, cultivating African-American heirlooms or plants and foods that were unique to us and waxing poetic about the stories of those foods and making a good living off of those. I mean, we sell those foods with the story, right? And we're part of the story. And that often gives me pause. And I don't know how you feel about it, but that's probably something that you should commit to writing. How do you feel about that? You know, articulate what your response is. Why are you neutral about it? Are you negative about it? Do you see any sort of flattery in that sort of continuation of our traditions, even if the people don't look like us and don't have the same end to their purpose? But for me, I think that it's really critical that we put those heirlooms and those crops back in the hands of growers of color, of people of color, so that we can begin to not only propagate them for the purpose of feeding ourselves and keeping ourselves healthy and nourished and also informed. Because along with those crops do come the stories, do come the lore, do come the language, and the spirituality of relating to the land. And then we can have deeper conversations later about our issues with occupying a land that isn't ours to begin with. But you can't have that conversation until your hands are in the dirt. African Americans, after the Civil War through to the end of Jim Crow, lost 100,000 acres of land. And with that, we lost access to an entire way of relating to nature, of values of delayed gratification, values of ownership and agency. And furthermore, just feeding ourselves. We may have been poor, we may have been destitute, but you know something? On a lot of those southern farms, we ate. We knew how to take care of ourselves and take care of each other and help each other survive. We knew what was good for our bodies and what was good for our souls. And that's such an important part of that soul food tradition, is the fact that we know there's a transfer of energy from the water and the air and the land back to our bodies and outward again. And so that's why it's so important to investigate what our heirlooms are, where they came from, and how we can grow them again, and how we can use them to empower our community and take back that power, that platform, and that privilege that so easily often gets given away. What we're gonna be making today is we're gonna make okra, corn, and tomato stew. This is part of that family of okra dishes. Now, if you change a few ingredients, you get okra soup. If you change them a little bit more, you get gumbo. But okra gumbo, because there's also filet gumbo. You change it a little bit more, you get limp and Susan, which is okra and rice. Change it a little bit more, you get okra and black-eyed peas. So there's a whole complex of dishes that involve okra. If you go to the Caribbean, you get okra and fungi, which is the cornmeal pudding that has okra in it. So there are all these dishes that combine the flavors of okra, onion, tomato, and pepper. And also, of course, there's the corn. It's a very summer dish. And a lot of these foods that we're making really involve the seasons. We're gonna start with bacon. Of course, for me, it's gonna be kosher beef bacon. And we're going to render it so we can begin to build the flavor. Even the fat that you use in this, if you choose to use meat, is very important. If you don't, there are variations that we can talk about. But for me, I'm going to use the beef bacon, render it, get the fat out of it, cook it for about 5 minutes. We're going to start there and build what some people might call a sofrito, and then go on to put in the tomatoes, make a broth, and then we're going to end up with what we call, in our terminology, a stoop. So something between a soup and a stew, but not really much of either. So here we go. So I'm gonna take this beef bacon. I'm gonna use my hands at this point, and you can see it's pretty fatty. And the whole goal is to really make sure that the bottom of this cast iron skillet is pretty coated. And we're gonna use this in the dish, but for right now, the main goal is to get all the fat out of it. For this, I'm gonna go old school cast iron, which is kind of like what our ancestors had. They had cast iron pots, they had cast iron skillets. They didn't look like this, and they didn't have a lot. I mean, you would have had maybe those two things, maybe a lid, maybe a couple of wooden spoons, and that's why so many of the meals involved one skillet or one pot meals. One thing I want to stress about this way of cooking is that this is not part of Western culture. This is part of African culture, where you cook with your senses. You cook with your sense of smell. You cook with your sense of touch, your sensitivity to the heat, how things look to the eye. Obviously, we don't want to burn the bacon, but we also don't want to overdo it. So I'm only going to turn this as many times as it takes to really make sure that both sides, we have that grease leaking out. This meat here is not really there for any other reason than to be a condiment. It is not an entree, it is a condiment. It is there to flavor, it is not there to replace the vegetables that are the star of the show. And it's not because of any sort of, preferences or values. It's because of the fact that fresh meat from domesticated animals was simply not, and still isn't, the main form of protein in West Central Africa. It's not easy to raise. These animals are expensive. And also in the Deep South, racial caste laws that were passed to control the lives of enslaved people, meant that they were not allowed to keep domesticated animals in some locations. And in others, they were so rare that a community would own a cow or hog in common. And even after enslavement, People just didn't, chow down on fresh meat every day. It just wasn't a thing. So I'm gonna make sure that the bacon cooks for about 5 to 10 minutes altogether while it renders. You wanna render it slowly. You don't want to make it fast. The goal is not to have crispy bacon you can throw on the table. The goal is to have bacon that gives up its essence, and then we can take it out and use it to add more flavor to the dish and add a little bit of texture once it's crispy. So now that the bacon has pretty much rendered and it's very crispy, we're gonna take it out and let it drain. And now we have a lot of really good tallow at the bottom of the pan. Now, back in the motherland, this would have been palm oil or shea oil, and that would have been the primary fat that people would have used. So the first thing we're gonna do is start this the way a lot of African mothers do start, which is adding the onions, the alliums, onion, garlic, leeks, chives, shallot. All those things were found in West Africa as well as in Europe. Hear that sizzle? And so now I'm gonna shift from the tongs to everybody's favorite, the wooden spoon. Now, if you grew up in a black household, I assure you, the wooden spoon was many things. It was taster, it was tester, and it was corporal punishment on occasion if you did the wrong thing. But to me, nothing says our cooking more than, in the words of Jessica Harris, iron pots and wooden spoons. This doesn't take that long. You're gonna put the onion in the bacon fat or in shortening if you choose, or margarine. If you are making this vegetarian or vegan. And remember that all margarines are not created equal, all vegan butters are not created equal. Use them at your discretion. But as for me, I'm gonna use this kosher bacon fat to cook the onion until it's translucent and gives it its flavor. And even though there's a little bit of salt and seasoning in the bacon, I'm just gonna give this a gentle pinch of kosher salt. You can use kosher salt, you use sea salt, whatever your preference. For me, it's always been about finding the right ingredients, finding the ingredients that make your dish special. Everybody has the same salt, the same pepper, the same this, the same that. What's the point? And the same formula, what's the point? You should be having a little bit of fun with this. People should leave your house going, I wanna make that. When they try to make it, they can't make it ever as good as you can because they don't have the right things. That's why you have to make this personal. This pot is you. It's personal. I can't use someone else's utensils to make my food because I have a relationship with the pan. I have a relationship with the spoon, So we build that flavor by first having whatever the fat of our choice, then adding the onion, or you can add garlic if you want to this as well, and then adding the salt and some of the other seasonings. So step by step, you feel and taste the layers. So what I'm gonna do is I'm also gonna add a little bit of one of my favorite spices, kitchen pepper, which comes out of the medieval tradition. It also comes out of the trade with East Asia and the West Indies. And it also in some ways reflects some of the flavor preferences and spices you see in West Africa. Notice I didn't measure a thing. This is up to you. We have a saying in the black community, we put spices in our food till our ancestors say stop. And that's how we rock. Now, here comes the dangerous part. You're gonna put in a tiny, tiny pinch of red pepper. Remember, these chilies that I've cut up, these cayenne peppers, they're nothing special, but they're the peppers that we grew and have grown for centuries. The goal is never to make it so hot that it becomes a test of courage to eat somebody's food. So at this point, the onions are getting a little bit brown and they're already translucent. So we're gonna go ahead and do a little bit of a modern cheat. There weren't really a lot of paste tomatoes being grown in the enslaved community at that point. We cannot forget that tomatoes have different purposes. Some are better eaten fresh in salads. Some are better for tomato sauce. Some are better for this kind of paste, which comes a basis for tomato jams. Yes, there's such thing as tomato jams and other elements. And so we're gonna cook that for a little bit the way they do in West Africa. You know, contemporary West African cuisine is not the same thing as the cuisine of our ancestors because obviously there's certain advantages that you have in the contemporary kitchen, like tomato paste or bouillon cubes, et cetera, that become part of the cuisine. And so I make the argument that just like there's soul food and proto-Southern food, and there's Italian food from different regions of Italy, and there's different types of Italian-American food, we still have to make the distinction between the food of, you know, centuries ago in pre-colonial West Africa and the food that people have today. And again, we're gonna keep on building a flavor with a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. This is just plain black pepper. We have already used a little bit of our kitchen pepper in here. Put the tomatoes in. The thing is, the tomatoes have to like break down a little bit. They would need at least a 20-minute cooking time. So the type of tomato that you want to put in, there's a type of tomato that's juicy and ripe, and red is the preferred color here. There's a real preference for reddish foods in West African cuisine, and the palm oil, the red peppers, the tomato, all add to that kind of effect, and some of the spices as well. So you want a tomato that's gonna render your juice and cook down a little bit to add moisture to the pot. It's also gonna make it nice and stoopy, somewhere between a soup and a stew. And you don't want it to be too clunky, and you don't want it to be too wet. This is the kind of food that you might eat in the homeland with your fingers, with fufu or with rice, or with a nice big wooden spoon in America. So while that cooks down, I'm gonna shift over to talking about the okra for a minute. So one of the problems with okra for many people in the West is that okra is mucilaginous, which is a fancy word for slimy as snot. So I don't particularly like that. However, in West Africa, they prefer their okra as snotty and slimy as possible because it's thick. And the reason why they do that is because when you eat okra with banku, kenke, fufu, foods that are starches, you don't really chew those foods, you kind of just swallow them. And so the okra kind of acts as the, how do I put this in a good way? The gourmet lubricant for this food that you just kind of like dump in your stomach. But for me, I like okra that is pretty small. I mean, there's this okra. Everybody wants to go after this okra because they think, oh, I'm getting more for my money, but this is the okra that you want. It's not much bigger than my pinky. So you see it's only about 2 to 3 inches long, which means it's not gonna be old and it's not gonna be as slimy if that's not what you're looking for. So I tend to take the tip off and tend to take off the cap. And I don't wanna waste too much food. My grandmother probably said I'm wasting too much okra, but that's how I do it. And then cutting on the bias very thin. So I wanna make sure that the pieces are manageable. Otherwise, it's gonna be pretty gummy. And the older the okra, the more gummy it is. And I advise against using frozen okra. Use fresh okra when you can, especially okra that's in season. But you can learn to like okra beyond just fried okra. I did it. But it also took me just growing it myself and having a relationship with it. When I was growing up, okra was black medieval torture. You didn't get to leave the table until you finished your okra. And that made me hate it. And the one time that I had complete John Lewis good trouble resistance against okra, I basically swallowed one bite. The mother said, have another bite. And I said, if I have another bite, you'll make me take 5 more bites. So put it in my mouth. I left the table, went to bed pretty hungry, and I stomped up the stairs. You know that whole thing little kids do where they go. And I added like 5 more steps, as if we had that many steps. Then I got to the bathroom with the okra in my mouth, spat it out in the toilet, flushed the toilet, and went to bed. And now I like okra, to a point. And that's how you cut your okra. So I'm gonna add the okra now. So we can put the okra in, about 2 handfuls of this in. And that's gonna cook for about 10 to 15 minutes. And let me show you how to taste this properly, because some of y'all, you think that sticking the spoon in there and putting it in your mouth is cool. It's not. So this is the way we do it in our culture. Put it in the back of our hands. And we taste it that way. And we make sure our hands are clean again before we go to cook again. So that needs some serious salt. Not a ton, but just enough. And remember, the broth is gonna have a little bit of salt to it too, so just be careful. You're just doing this to let the juices out and build the flavor. You're not doing this to make it overly seasoned, because you want the vegetables to shine. You want the vegetables at their peak to tell a story. And for me, those vegetables tell a story of the gardens of our ancestors, the farms they kept, the pride they had in making something out of nothing and using everything they could from the land. I'll put a bit of my West African spice in here as well. And you want it to be very aromatic and very tempting, so if anybody passes by, they know that they should be in the kitchen eating your food. And the African way is to be generous. The African way is to make sure that you have enough food to feed as many people as could come by your house. Although I would say treat them to small plates. Don't treat them to a buffet. The African way is not to go broke. We go ahead and put some of our corn in, fresh corn from the cob. I put about 3 handfuls in. I still cook in handfuls. I still cook in pinches. I still cook that way. And yes, if you really need measurements, we got you. But for this moment, you're gonna cook with me the way I cook at home, the way I prepare our tradition. So you wanna make sure the corn is incorporated into the entire pan to the point where we see it everywhere. And I might put a little bit more handful in, because the corn will actually kind of shrink back a little bit, like the other ingredients have. Do one more little pinch of salt and adjust the seasonings and just let it go for about 15, 20 minutes. So what we want to do is make sure that this comes to a simmer, so you see it bubbling, and as my grandmother used to say, talking back to you. And then you don't want to talk back too much. She used to actually say to the pot, "Don't sass me." Turn the heat down. But it should be still cooking. You should smell it. You should hear it. Again, you cook with your senses. You don't just cook because the book says so. What if you didn't have a book? What if you didn't have a clock? What if you didn't have the tools to measure this? You have to learn how to cook with your feelings, with your intuition, with your wisdom, with experience, not just some sort of formula from a text. And I kind of want to put in a few little bits of herbs and things to make sure that everything comes together and give it some flavor. Some herbs are going to have to be put in fresh. And one of the herbs that I want to use in this is definitely a little bit of rosemary. And rosemary was definitely one of the foods that we had from Africa to America. It had come a long time ago from Europe and the Middle East into Africa. And I'm putting a whole sprig in. I'm letting it do its work. Of course, at the end, you have to remember to remove the sprig so that it's not in the way. You don't want anybody to choke on it, and you don't want anybody to bite into it by mistake. It's just there to give it more of an aromatic smell and flavor. One of the things I want to do is describe some of the elements of the dish. So, for example, the corn is cooked through. It looks like well-boiled corn. The tomatoes are not completely broken down, but they are soft. And the okra has wilted, and that's actually what you want. And the onion kind of fades into the background a bit. So right now we have a bit of the herbs, definitely the tomatoes. The corn doesn't have much of a taste, but the texture is there. You should hear it as you stir the pot. And so all of that's great. So what I like to do is There's already some beef bacon in there, but I want to finish it with a little bit of this crumbled bacon. And one thing I love to do is add in fresh herbs, which also, again, is a convention that we have. So I don't really like to talk and chop, but I'm gonna cut up a little bit of fresh sage and a little bit of fresh parsley, just a rough chop. And put a little bit of each in there. I've already put the rosemary in there. Put a little bit of the flat leaf parsley is my favorite. A little bit of thyme in there. You cook it till it's done. That's the joke I make with people, and it's really not a joke. They ask me, what's my technique? I say, I put it in a cast iron pan, I stir it, and I cook it till it's done. That's my technique. So now's the best part. I'm just gonna dig into this a little bit. I have a little bit of rice here, cooked in broth. I'm gonna put a little bit on this plate because I'm about to eat something, and you just happen to be with me. So that's the way this is gonna work. And my grandmother used to say, don't wait on ceremony. So we're gonna take some of this stew, put it on top, and see how it tastes. Smells right. Now this could be rice, it could be fufu, it could be broken up cornbread, so many different things. But look at that color. And it has that smell that you get from a lot of our foods and dishes. That savory smell, that tomatoey meets hot pepper, meets spice, meets love smell. So I'm gonna borrow this spoon back and just dig in. You can feel the corn. It's just kind of, to use the Italian expression, a little bit of al dente to the teeth, but it's done. It's done. It tastes good, and the sweetness is out of it. And tomato has really rendered, and the tomato paste has helped it along. And the okra is not slimy at all. It's like a nice, plump, fresh green vegetable, no problems. I'm gonna eat this right in front of y'all, right? No shame in my game. Awesome. And that's okra, tomato, corn, stew. So I'm really excited about working with you on this recipe. This is a black-eyed pea goldmine called akara. Akara are fritters that are extremely popular in West Africa. They're found in almost every African country along the Atlantic coast from which our ancestors were taken. And they are, I guess, West Africa's answer to falafel. And what's cool about them is that you remove the skins. You can do this, the cheating version where you just grind everything up, but actually they taste better and I think they look better with the eyes off. And I'm gonna show you how to do that. Black-eyed peas are really, really special. I remember growing up, and every New Year's on the strike of midnight, I would run around the house and put black-eyed peas in everybody's wallet and everybody's purse. And I thought that was just us until I started talking to other African Americans of my generation. They said, and older, and they said, oh yeah, we did that too. We put black-eyed peas in our wallets and in our purses on New Year's Day for good luck and to have money. So in Senegal, you would make a pot of niébé. Niébé is the word in Wolof and Fula for black-eyed peas, okay? So you make a pot of black-eyed peas to give to someone who doesn't have any food, someone who is unfortunately having to beg for money and food on the street. And so before you can get a blessing on your business, on your house, to have a child, anything, you have to make a pot of niébé. And usually you serve that with cheb, with rice, which is basically the precursor dish to hop and john. And you go to the person, and you don't just shove a pot of food in their face. You sit down with them, and it's your duty to treat them like a human being and share a meal with them in the gracious and hospitable way. And in this act of charity, only then can you receive a blessing once you bless somebody else. So one of the things that I like to do with that story is teach people our ancestors did these things not because they were primitive or they were superstitious. They did these things because These were part of the values of their lives, the values that they wanted to pass down to us, were it not for the interruption of the transatlantic slave trade and its exploitation of our bodies, our minds, and our labor. So here, we're gonna do a version that is very popular with my friend Pierre Cham. He's a Senegalese chef who lives in New York. And Pierre does the version that I saw when I went to Senegal. It was my first trip to West Africa. And even though I knew about akara and I had them before, the akara in Senegal are very sort of like falafelish, tater-tatish. And on the street, they were sold by a lady in Saint Louis, which was a major part of the colonial period and also the slave trade. And I remember she was sitting there in her little corner on her stool. Her daughter was helping her, and she was constantly making these akara in a little small charcoal fire stove. And all day long, all she did was make akara. And we went up to her, we bought one of the newspaper cones of black-eyed pea fritters, and I munched on them the rest of the way. And I wanted a second newspaper cone of them because they were so delicious. In other places, they're a little bit more crunchy, a little bit more golf ball-y, and depending upon what country you're in, they change a little bit, but they are the same deep-fried snack that you can find anywhere in the markets of West Africa and the streets of West Africa. But I just want to show you a very simple sort of one station to next station process for how you can make them. They're a little bit tedious, but once you get the hang of it, they're fantastic. So the first thing I'm gonna do while I talk to you is I'm gonna get the oil heated up. This is peanut oil. Of course, you can use vegetable oil or canola oil if you so desire. I'm using peanut oil because Pierre Cham says that's what he does, and it's very common in Senegal. Let's start there. Time this heats up, we'll be ready to go. Okay, so the first things first. This is about a cup of black-eyed peas, dried. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this boiling hot water and we're going to pour it over the black-eyed peas. Now, what you're trying to do is semi-ferment them, give them a slight ferment. So what we're gonna do is pour the hot water over them and let them sit covered. And they're gonna be like that for about 24 hours. And that's the most important thing, is to make sure that they are soaked properly and that they're soaked in such a way that the skins come easily off when we prepare them. We're gonna set these aside for a bit, but I do want you to notice that immediately the process is already beginning. The skins are gonna start to get soft very quickly. Even right now, some of the skins are already coming off of the black-eyed peas. So what we're gonna look for is that we're gonna cover these up. We're gonna have these sitting in the boiling hot water, which will get cold, and then 24 hours later, we will take the skins off. The next thing we're gonna do is take these peas, which have been soaking for a day or so, and you can see they're already plump. They're sort of already on their way, and the skins will immediately start to come off. So you get these lovely skinned black-eyed peas. Now, if you want a real be a cheat, you can always go to any number of West African markets, and they will already have, I assure you, black-eyed peas that have already been skinned and dried, ready for you to make into akara or moi moi. But it's pretty easy. All you really have to do is rub them between your fingers. And again, this is something that you do with someone else. I can't say that clearly enough. Our cooking is not just about eating by ourselves or cooking by ourselves. We cook with other people. We eat with other people. We share our food with other people. We create dishes that inspire us to be communal. That's just showing our values. Our food is supposed to inspire us to be generous. It's supposed to inspire us to share. It's supposed to inspire us to look beyond dark and bad days for something better. Once I started to really grasp the idea that our values and our morals and our ethics came through our food. It was a really beautiful moment for me. A moment of catharsis where I just realized that so many of the lies we get told about this tradition, you know, being just simple and comforting and not that complex and not intellectual. They go screaming out the door once you really begin to investigate the roots of our food. So as you can see, they come off a little bit at a time. You get a lot of attention out of your system by doing this. But if you do this with someone else, it's fun because then you get to talk mess about other folks and talk mess about yourselves and really sort of have a therapy moment as you get the skins of the black eyed peas. Because if you make enough akara for a lot of people, this ain't gonna feed nobody, y'all. You need to have a lot of black eyed peas. So be prepared to have several sacks of black eyed peas that you soak, that you allow to soak overnight, and that you get the skins off and semi-ferment. Then and only then are you gonna have that constant supply that sister in Senegal had as she made the akara on the side of the road. But you can see how the skins are already coming off. And if you just keep doing this and rubbing it between your hands, you'll have the necessary result. Okay, cool. Here are the skinless black eyed peas. White as newborn cicadas. And they are ready to be crushed in the blender. Now you may go, wait a minute, there wasn't no blender in Africa 300 years ago. Exactly. This was your damn blender 300 years ago in Africa and still is today in many places. But to be honest with you, contemporary Africans love blenders because they do the work of the hand, mortar, and pestle. This guy is called odo because that's the onomatopoeia, the sound of the pestle hitting the mortar. And of course, if you've ever seen pictures of West Africa, the pictures of the kitchens, the villages, they will always be the standing mortar and pestle and the small mortar and pestle. And if you've ever been there, the first sound you hear in the morning is, of course, and it's rhythmic. With African culture, we play at work and work at play. Never just, oh, this is drudgery, bam, bam, bam. And especially it's fun when you hear the young girls do the mortar and pestle to pound the couscous or the fufu. And they always sing and clap. And the coolest thing in the world is to see them with the tall mortar and pestle. And what they'll do is they'll throw it up in the air. And while it's in the air, they'll clap. And then by the time it comes down, there's the other part of the percussive sound. So the food engenders the music. And it's a big part of everything else. So we're gonna do this really quickly. Just wanna show you what this looks like. I should bring this over here instead of spreading water all over the place. And then again, I was always messy in the kitchen. I'm just being real with you. It's just you and me. So we're gonna take a little bit, I'm just gonna demonstrate this because I wanna show you what this looks like. I'm gonna take a couple handfuls of the already skinned black eyed peas, throw the onion in there, throw the baking soda in there, about a teaspoon, throw the salt in there, and have a little bit of the water. Not much, you don't need a lot. And we're gonna blend that for a little bit till it comes to a paste. And if you need to, you can make sure that you need to put some more in, that's great. But you need to break these down until they are finely ground. And you don't want it too wet and you don't want it too dry. You want it in a soft spot like a batter. In addition to the baking soda and the salt and the onion, I'm gonna put a little bit of a spice mix I've created that draws on West African flavors. A little paprika, a little cayenne, a couple of other spices that we'll talk about later. And with akara, you're gonna have to constantly sort of like draw it back to the bottom of the blender until it's properly pulsed together. Do that one more time. So we just happen to have some akara batter already made. So now this oil is very hot. So I'm gonna show you a little bit of a trick that my grandmother taught me. So how do you know oil is hot? Do you use a thermometer, or do you use little pieces of bread or a piece of onion or something that once it goes in, it'll start to dance a little bit, and when that's just light brown, then you're gonna want to take it out and then start to fry. Now, if you want, you can add garlic, you can add herbs, you can add other things to the akara. I would probably only use garlic and a little bit of hot pepper at most. It's not supposed to be a complicated sort of fritter. You know, don't get too crazy with it, because the strength of akara is that it carries a sauce well. The strength of akara is that it's very simple and very clean. And anything you do that mars that taste takes away from akara. And if you're Southern to West African, they will let you know really fast that ain't akara. Okay, I think it's ready. I didn't use a lot of deep oil for this. And what I'm gonna have to do is let them cook on one side for a few minutes and then go back and turn them. You can deep fry, but you have to be really vigilant. You can't let them, leave your sight. You wanna make sure they're cooked on both sides and that they're not raw in the middle. So a couple minutes is what you need to do. Let them fry. Cook them like you would donuts, like you would hush puppies. Now, of course, back in West Africa, they didn't have ice cream scoopers used for these things either, but it's very convenient and it's very easy, and I'm sure our ancestors would have approved if they had them themselves. So we're gonna let those cook for a minute. So now that I have my mortar and pestle, my odo, what I'm going to do is take one of the Maggi tablets, and Maggi is very controversial, and I realize that, but it's also something that is very much a part of contemporary urban West African cuisine. And what I'm going to do is pound them up to a powder. You realize that the cooking of our ancestors, West African and from the American South and the Caribbean and Brazil and other places, was very physical. You know, you burned your calories doing the work to get the food to the table. And I like that. C'est très bon. So you can see they're already kind of like light and golden, and that's exactly where you want them to be. And notice I didn't really time them or anything. Like I said, you cook with your body, with your senses, with your sense of smell, with your ears. I guess you could say that the cooking time is 3 to 5 minutes aside, but the first thing you should do is cook these and fail. Absolutely mess them up. And you won't want to mess them up again. And so you'll learn the cues that you need to make sure the dish is where you need it to be. So I would say 3 to 5 minutes is a nice guideline, but doesn't make it so. You really have to practice. And once you get them down, it's smooth sailing from there. So now that these have been cooking for a bit, I've just let them become golden brown on both sides, making sure that they felt and sounded cooked. I mean, to sound cooked, not quite hollow, but a little bit of a tap. The feeling will come to you, and you'll know they're pretty much done. They shouldn't be too brown, but they should be a nice golden brown. So you see, this color is what I'm looking for right here. Right here. So that's what you want. For some people, golden brown is very brown. For me, golden brown is a very specific color and moment. So one of the things that we're gonna do is we're gonna flavor these. Pierre Cham has a salt that he does with sorrel or hibiscus. Some people call it Jamaica. And it's not quite the ornamental hibiscus flower that you see. if you've ever had hibiscus tea, we're talking about the same flower. And it's a flower that tastes kind of cranberry-ish when you make it into a tea and sweeten it slightly. And so what we're gonna do is have this tart but slightly floral flour ground with kosher salt. And I throw in a bit of cayenne pepper or red chili flakes to give it some more color. And we're gonna gently sprinkle that on with a little pinch of my West African seasoning and some of the ground up magi, which will make it even more savory and oniony in taste. But can you imagine that this was a food that wasn't just prepared in the house, it was actually sold on the streets of Rio and New Orleans and Richmond, Virginia, and other cities, Charleston. And it was sold by Black women and speaks to a legacy of using that entrepreneurial spirit of selling our traditional foods to every kind of eater, Black, white, in between. Sometimes those women were using that money to buy things for themselves, their children, their husbands, that encouraged the spirit of humanity despite being enslaved. Or maybe they were free women of color who bought their freedom by selling food like akara, akaraje, kala, or congri on the street, black-eyed pea cakes. The bottom line is it goes to speak to a heritage of a people who use food to empower themselves, not to reinforce their status as enslaved chattel in an unjust society. So when you make these foods, the stories go with them. Here, look at this hibiscus salt. It's like beautiful pink sand. It reminds me of Senegal in a way, because there's a whole lake called Lac Rose, and Lac Rose makes pink salt. We're gonna take a little tiny pinch. That already has a lot on it. I love when things fall all over the place. It's very decadent to me. And then the West African seasoning doesn't have any salt in it, so that's great. We won't over-season. We'll make it a little bit, tiny bit more peppery. Then we got all kinds of colors working here. And the tiniest pinch of magi, because that's definitely a little salty. So a little bit of newsprint without the print, and throw them in to a lovely cone. So that's what they look like in the cone, just like they did on the back of that carriage in Senegal. And they just kind of spell out. So I'm gonna have a tiny bit of akara. I'm gonna show you the insides. Look at that. All good and done inside. Golden brown on the outside. I'm gonna do a little dip on the surface. And if you don't like black-eyed peas and how they taste, these don't taste like black-eyed peas. They don't even taste like falafel. They have a very neutral taste with a bit of edge of earthiness to them. So it's a little bit the best of both worlds without being too overwhelming. And that's akara, the black-eyed pea cake that saved our ancestors and preserved our culture. As you look through those pieces of our history and our story, it's so critical to be able to see how our roots, how our customs, how the things that were passed down to us, and how our culture all sort of intersect. You have to look at this through a holistic lens. It's not one piece above the others. There is no such thing as, let's just look at the food for what it's worth and the ingredients and look at a couple of stereotypes and fake lore, and that's our culinary tradition. Our culinary tradition is rooted. Our culinary tradition is specific, and our culinary tradition is contextual. And so by putting all those different pieces together, what I'm hoping that you'll get out of this, and what I'm hoping you'll take away, is this idea that that complexity relies on how much you know your own story and how much you're able to connect your story to these wider, bigger themes that attach all of our African Atlantic histories together in one bundle. You know, when I talk about food, I want people outside of our group, outside of our bubble, outside of our community, to be able to understand and see themselves in our own narrative. You know, when people talk about Irish history and Irish culture, especially the history of the Irish in America, it is almost impossible not to have the potato famine of the mid-19th century brought up. And what's so remarkably humanizing about that narrative is that, there were, thousands of people who were killed through starvation. And there were millions of people who immigrated to all corners of the world after that massive catastrophe. And it wasn't just a natural catastrophe, but a catastrophe that could have been avoided or given assistance, but there were oppressive factors and marginalizing factors against the Irish people. And so that event alone, among others, has been my inspiration to give you sort of a perspective that says to you, hey, we have very similar narratives in our own culture and history. In fact, narratives that connect to this narrative and beyond. So we have these stories that connect us not just based on a sense of oppression or trauma, but also a sense of survival and a commitment to strive, a commitment to overcome. And once you, as people, as human beings, understand displacement or taking back your heritage foods or heirloom ingredients for the purpose of rebuilding and recommitting to a new understanding of who your people are, there's a connection there. People can look at each other and go, okay, we went through that, you went through that. We have something in common. We have a conversation that we can have that puts us beyond the spaces that have been created by a hierarchical perception of race and color. The first thing you should do when you finish this class is start gathering. Gather pictures of your kitchens, people who were in them, kitchen table conversations. If nothing else, start creating something that you can pass down. There is no sin, there is no problem in making your own food narratives and stories. The night after my mother passed away, I was doing a college lecture and I was talking about the importance of having your own food stories. And I asked the group of university students, I said, well, what is the thing that connects you, the comfort food, the something, the dish? And this young lady looked at me in embarrassment and said, well, it's this ramen salad my mom and I make. And part of it was wisdom and part of it was grief. And I said, I want you to record that recipe, to write it down, and commit to making it with the next generation. And I was in the right place to say that because I just lost the most important person in my life. And a lot of times we think about these things in terms of loss, right? Losing someone, losing something, losing what those people represent. But it's not, to me, there's something that you should do before you lose something. And that is preserve and protect it. For some people, to be honest with you, and I say this in hopes that it's not your story, for some people, we're faced with the loss of our own memory, our own consciousness. For other people, we're faced with never having those stories to begin with. I often get contacted by people who are adoptees or have been adopted and rediscovered their biological roots or biological family. And so then I'm confronted with, well, I never grew up with any stories. I'm just trying to figure out who I was before I had this other reality. And that's a process. How do you respect the reality you were raised with or survive with to this point and the reality that you come from? Things that were hidden from you, things that you didn't know about. So you start the process now. You don't wait on ceremony. And if it's just you in your own mind, your own self, and your own journey, that's where you begin. And if it's not, the best thing I can tell you is to always make sure that you find a community of learners that you can learn with. This isn't a singular journey. There's a journey that you take with your spouse, with your children, with your partner, with your friends, with your remaining family, with your larger extended family, with people who may not look like you or sound like you or act like you, but have the same concern and passion. Because, as we say, life is with people, and so is learning.